Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Pakistan Experience and Eid Mubarak to everybody celebrating. It's quite an honor to talk to today's guest. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure आप सब जानते ही होंगे, but मजबूरी में फिर भी मैं इंट्रोडक्शन करवा दूं जो कुछ लोग रह गए हैं जो ऐसे लेजेंड को नहीं जानते. Urvashi Butalia is here with us today. She's an activist and academic, even though she doesn't like calling herself an academic, but I do see her as one. She founded India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, currently runs Zubaan Books and has written the seminal book, The Other Side of Silence. Hello, Urvashi, how are you doing?
Hi, Shahzad. Doing well, thank you. Flattery, as they say, will get you everywhere.
A lot of people ask, like, what's your trick? I'm like, मैं तारीफें करता हूँ लोगों की. I trick them into thinking that they're having fun, flattery करके.
नहीं वो they're having fun. I've watched your episode, so मजा तो आएगा ही आएगा. आपको भी ईद मुबारक. और मैं आपको एक बात बोल दूं, as a feminist, there are certain words that are not allowed to enter my vocabulary. Seminal is one of them.
Seminal लफ्ज में कुछ प्रॉब्लम है?
कुछ प्रॉब्लम है. आता कहाँ से है?
Men से?
आता है? हाँ?
Semen से आता है?
Semen, yes. तो उसको निकाल दीजिए, अपनी वोकैबुलरी में से भी निकाल दीजिए.
मैंने सोचा भी नहीं था कभी कि ये कनेक्शंस किस तरह बनते हैं लफ्जों के. It's always such a struggle to talk to somebody as well accomplished as you, because मुझे समझ नहीं आती मैं कितने threads. It's like kid in a candy store कि मुझे इतनी बातें करनी है. Maybe let's start, क्योंकि आपने लफ्जों का जिक्र कर दिया. ये बहुत facetious और cliched बात होती है कि history is his story, and it's almost become such a cliche that we need to write her story. But इस cliched बात से अगर हम actually इसको examine करें, is it true that when women write about history, it is fundamentally different than when it is his story?
So I don't know enough about. I've heard this said, his story, and I don't know whether that is the root of the word, because there is also one line of thinking that says it comes from the word hist, to listen. So I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but the fact of the matter is that yes, history tends to be the way we understand history, which is really a Western conception of recording the past, events of the past, in order to make sense somewhere or how to see them in the present. And that recording is done by men, traditionally has been done by men, and is based on certain ideas of what is objective and what is important to record, which is by and large seen as the lives of great men. Now, when women have started to question this and look at history, there has been a fundamental change. First of all, in the very interesting things of temporalities, because the timelines along which our histories are divided, आपके मुल्क में, मेरे मुल्क में, ये सोचा जाता है कि 3 periods हैं, ancient, medieval और modern. And in India, at least, that's broadly identified with ancient equals Hindu, medieval equals Mughal, modern equals British. लेकिन अगर आप इन periods को देखें और आप औरतों की जिंदगी को देखें, तो women's lives do not coincide with these periods. So, for example, when India and Pakistan come into being and both countries become independent, it doesn't mean that women's lives see a huge improvement. You see a change, but you don't necessarily see it in women's lives. That process continues beyond that particular date of August 1947. That's what I mean. So, in a sense, women's history questions these divisions, the linearity of these divisions also. But also one of the things that women have brought to history, to the understanding of history, is the fact that औरतों को अगर आप सारे अपने इतिहास में से बाहर निकाल ही दें, तो वो तो अधूरा ही रह जाएगा ना, आधा ही है. और उसमें आप उनको अगर डालेंगे, तो आप वो महारानियों वगैरह को नहीं डाल सकते सिर्फ, लेकिन you have to look at ordinary people. And when you look at ordinary people and when you look at the lives of women, that means कि आपको जो अंदर की जिंदगी है, अंदरूनी जिंदगी, उसमें जाना पड़ेगा. और आप उसमें जाएंगे तो सब कुछ बदल जाएगा. Because otherwise, that whole notion of objectivity will change. Stories will become important. Women's voices will become important. You'll have to start seeing the domestic as a valid area of inquiry. You will have to start looking at children And once you start looking at marginalized people like women, then you have to start seeing other forms of marginalization, such as caste in both our societies, such as religion, such as poverty. All these things intersect. So all of this comes from, I think, a feminist and a female perspective on history.
So हम जब मार्जिनाइज कम्युनिटीज की बात करते हैं सबऑल्टर्न स्टडीज में, वो कहेंगे कि जो भी सबऑल्टर्न है, a lot of now people are uncovering sexualities, this is फॉल्स नोशन की, ये बड़ा वेस्टर्न आइडिया है, जबकि हम अपनी स्पेक्ट्रम हिस्ट्री के देखें तो आपको बहुत क्वेयर हिस्ट्री मिलेगी। तो सब अपनी अपनी कम्युनिटीज के आर्ग्यू करते हैं कि जी हमारा इरेजर हुआ है एंड द हिस्ट्री एट द मार्जिन इज नॉट रिटन। सो द इरेजर ऑफ वुमेन, इज दैट यूनिक और इज दैट पार्ट ऑफ द सेम कल्चर, या डू यू फील कि जो वुमेन का इरेजर है उसमें एक यूनिकनेस भी है?
नहीं, वो इट इज पार्ट ऑफ द सेम कल्चर, और उसमें एक यूनिकनेस भी है, क्योंकि उसमें आप देखते हैं कि एक तो पेट्रियार्की का दबाव है ही है, जो कि सारी औरतें, नो मैटर व्हाट देयर क्लास और व्हाट देयर रिलीजन और व्हाट देयर कास्ट वगैरह, दे ऑल एक्सपीरियंस इट। लेकिन उसके साथ और भी चीजें हैं, उसके साथ में जब और भी चीजें मिल जाती हैं, देन यू गेट अ वेरी डिफरेंट फॉर्म ऑफ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन एंड ऑपरेशन, एंड ऑल्सो बिकॉज women's lives are so tied in with the valorization in our society, चाहे हम पाकिस्तानी हैं या हिंदुस्तानी हैं, वो चीज़ तो वही है, valorization of marriage as the be all and end all and of the family, कि वो सारी जिम्मेवारी औरत के ऊपर है. So for her, the experience of discrimination, the experience of violence is very intermixed and intermeshed with the experience of love, of caring, of security, of the family, of her children. And it becomes extremely difficult to disentangle that. So I think that is the uniqueness in women's experiences, but I don't want to set up a hierarchy of discrimination and say कि औरतों की unique है, औरों की नहीं है. तो हर एक जो क्या कहते हैं, हर एक जो सेक्शन है, उनका जो एक्सपीरियंस है, वो उनके पर्टिकुलर कॉन्टेक्स्ट से वो उसको एक्सपीरियंस करते हैं, वो तजर्बा उनका होता है, and that is where they are coming from. So they're all different kinds of forms of discrimination. Somewhere they intersect also, but it's not as if one is worse or they're different. I would not like to use a hierarchized word.
I mean, I think abhi main things that you see right now stay in your head. There's this documentary on Netflix called How to Become a Dictator, and one of the tenets they were arguing was that you need to marginalize women, you need to erase the role of women in society, you need to subjugate women ko aap aage na aane de. It's part of the dictatorial regime, and obviously one can't make a claim कि historically हर जगह ये शायद ऐसा हुआ है, but in terms of nation building, especially subcontinent mein, it's been very masculine, that nation building. So wo unconsciously women ka erasure hai, or do you feel like there's also deliberate erasure of women in that patriarchal nation building project that has encompassed both our countries?
Actually, Shahzad, I don't think it's an erasure. I think women are central to that project of nation making, and even central. I haven't seen this Netflix film. I've heard about it, और मैं सोच रही थी कि देखूंगी.
अच्छी है, काफी अच्छी है.
अच्छी है, हाँ, मैंने सुना है. लेकिन उसमें भी आप देखेंगे, मतलब वो हिटलर की कहानी होगी, सद्दाम हुसैन की कहानी होगी, मुसोलिनी की होगी, सबकी होगी. उसमें भी आप देखिए कि औरतें, उनको मतलब नजरअंदाज नहीं किया जाता है, पर उनको एक खास रोल में कास्ट किया जाता है. So, and that खास role is the role of mothers, and the role of the mothers of the nation, and the role of retaining the purity of the breed, the religion, whatever it is. So Germany में जब Jewish आदमियों की नॉन ज्यूइश औरतों से शादी होती थी, तो वो औरतों को टारगेट किया जाता था. क्यों? इसलिए कि वो जो आर्यन प्योरिटी हिटलर एस्टैब्लिश करने की कोशिश कर रहा था, उसको लगता था कि ये तो बिल्कुल ही इससे रद्द हो जाएगी.
जूइश लव जिहाद हो रही थी वहां पर.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल, हाँ हाँ. तो ये इस हमारे यहाँ भी ये हुआ, आपके यहाँ भी ये हुआ. And then there is the other thing that women become at this moments like this, their bodies become symbolic of the honor of the nation. So हर इस तरह की नेशन मेकिंग प्रोसेस में जो वायलेंट होता है, आप देखेंगे कि औरतों के साथ सेक्सुअल वायलेंस जबरदस्त तरह से किया जाता है. और आप देखेंगे कि that sexual violence, it has a vocabulary, and that is, we, the men of X nation, will attack the women of Y nation, and you, the men of Y nation, will understand exactly what this means. So it's like a contract between those two. They are agreed on it, that the violation of those women's bodies, the meanings of that are very clear to the warring sides, and those are both men. And it becomes absolutely, तो वो वेपन ही क्या होता है कि एक तरफ से औरतों को अटैक करेंगे, दूसरी तरफ से औरतों को अटैक करेंगे. और उसमें another thing that happens, which I found in my work on partition, and it came as a shock to me because I had also bought into this this received wisdom that जब at moments of political violence like that, औरतों के ऊपर जब attack होता है, that attack or the violence always comes from the other side. So what happens is the violence of families towards their own women, that's completely wiped out. You don't see it. So I don't think that it is that women are invisibilized. I think they are made to play a very particular role. And that role is very much the role of upholding the honor of the nation, etc., and all of that.
So when you say violence on women by people in their own communities, are you talking about that notion where to protect their honor rather than, let's say, a Sikh village saying Muslim men will come and RAPEU, we will kill you before that happens to protect our honor? Or are you also suggesting that under the guise of partition, sexual violence was committed by people of the same communities on women of the same communities?
Yeah, both. I'm suggesting both. क्योंकि आपने मंटो की कहानी तो पढ़ी है ना, खोल दो. So you know what he's talking about. आपने जो अब पार्टीशन पे काफी सारा काम हुआ है, उससे भी ये पता चलता है clearly that so many families, especially in our side of the border, killed their own women theoretically in order to save them from possible violation, etc. Impregnation, all of those things. I don't know if that happened on your side because I'm not familiar with that history that much. But I suspect that if it did, it was much less because the notions of purity and pollution are very strong in Hinduism and rubs off also on Sikh families. But ये भी है शहजाद के normal times, जो वक्त जिसको हम कहते हैं normal times, उस टाइम में जो औरतों के साथ हिंसा ऑन अ रेगुलर बेसिस होता है, ऐसे तो नहीं होता कि जादू से जब कम्युनिटीज के बीच में झगड़े होने लगे तो अपने आदमी वो रोक देते हैं. They don't magically become good fellows who will not now exercise violence on their women. In fact, उस violence में, उस confusion में, उस लड़ाई झगड़े में, उस दंगे में आपको और मौके मिलते हैं इस तरह का वायलेंस करने की औरतों पे, और वो होता है, लेकिन वो किसी गिनती में नहीं आता है. नॉर्मल टाइम्स में भी किसी गिनती में नहीं आता है, और उस तरह के वक्त में बिल्कुल ही छिप जाता है.
I think यहाँ पर भी unfortunately जब cases आते हैं, there's a hashtag that goes around which is like hang the rapist, because the notion is look at this monster who's entered our pure society and इसको अगर hang कर देंगे हम सही हो जाएगा. Whereas we're talking about these huge events like partition, but छोटी चीजें भी हों, जिस तरह concerts में अक्सर यहाँ पर कोई security lapse हो जाए, women are targeted. जलसे, political जलसे, women are targeted. Whatever moment of lawlessness is created, because अनफॉर्चुनेटली सब कॉन्टिनेंट में लोगों को जाहिल रखा गया है. आई वुड नेवर से वो जाहिल हैं, बट ये नेशनलिस्ट प्रोजेक्ट्स जो उनको जाहिल रखती हैं, they're made to see women as objects, like माल हैं ये. एंड उस टर्मिनोलॉजी की वजह से any time lawlessness occurs, they almost see it like if you're stealing somebody's money. They see women literally as mal.
Yeah, they see women as property. they see women as markers of their honor. Basically, they're not willing to prepare to see that women might have a life, desires, needs, wants, or might want an autonomous existence. वो अगर लोग समझने की कोशिश करें ना तो उससे बहुत डर लगता है, बिकॉज देन इट मीन्स के हमारी सोसाइटी का पूरा जो सोशल स्ट्रक्चर है ना उसको भी आपको क्वेश्चन करना पड़ेगा, because that is structured on the family structured on the basis of the woman occupying the domestic space, the man occupying the public space, the woman's labor being unpaid and basically care work and not even seen as valuable. So she is invisible in many of those ways. तो फिर उस चीज से अगर आप औरतों को वहां से बाहर निकलने दें और उनको थोड़ी सी इंडिपेंडेंस दे दें तो बहुत डर की बात है कि वो आउट ऑफ कंट्रोल हो जाएंगे. तो इसीलिए एंड हियर आई थिंक इन आवर सोसाइटीज मजहब वजहब का कोई ऐसे फर्क नहीं होता है, सब वही बात लेके चलते हैं. ये जो हमारे मुल्क में अब ये सारा जो लव जिहाद का चक्कर हो रहा है ये क्या है? It is basically saying that the woman has no autonomy, that वो तो अपनी चॉइस एक्सरसाइज कर ही नहीं सकती है. और पता नहीं आपने सुना होगा कि नहीं, कुछ साल पहले एक केस हुआ था केरल में जहाँ की एक औरत जिसने she was a medical student, she converted to Islam on her own, and years later, 4 or 5 years later, in her medical college, she met a man and she married him. He was a Muslim. And she was 24. So by all the laws, she has the legal right to do whatever she wants. But her father reported to the courts, and the High Court of Kerala said that they would annul the marriage. Now, what right does the court have to annul a marriage of two adults? And everybody was convinced. I mean, there was so much discussion about her saying she has, this is love jihad and she's going to join IS. It's complete nonsense. And she's gone on to study medicine, become a doctor. She's perfectly happy. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, this is nonsense. They're two adults. Let them do what they want. But what was it other than saying she does not know her own mind and she doesn't have the right to make up her own mind? That's all it was.
I guess love jihad का भी वही idea है ना. Look at these Muslim men, ये हमारी औरतों को ले जाएंगे. It's what I was thinking about. हमारे मुल्क में मसला थोड़ा उल्टा है. It's about forced conversions. वहाँ पर it's the issue of minors and 13, 12, and they end up marrying these 40-year-old men under the guise कि ये लोग willfully they've come to Islam. No 12-year-old willfully converts their religion and marries a 40-year-old man. और अगर आपको इतना ही इस्लाम जाग रहा है कि भाई मैंने लोगों को कन्वर्ट करना है, आपको ये 12-13 साल की बच्चियां ही मिलती हैं कन्वर्ट करने के लिए, इनके बाप नहीं है. और अगर आपने तबलीग अगर करनी है अपनी, these are the only people you find and then you also marry them. So इधर forced conversion का बिल्कुल ही अलग मसला है, because I think society अलग है.
And then that creates a really difficult situation because वो बच्ची जब बड़ी होती है और अगर वो निकलना भी चाहे वो नहीं निकल सकती. Apart from the structure around her, उसके बच्चे हो जाएंगे, फिर वो कैसे छोड़ेगी अपने बच्चों को? That also becomes very, very difficult for her. So she's kind of caught in that.
I had a strange thought. When we talk about violence on women, a lot of times the articulation, even cricket match हो, उसमें भी लोग इस तरह की बातें करते हैं कि अगर इंडिया ने हरा दिया या पाकिस्तान ने हरा दिया, आप सोशल मीडिया पे जाएं तो लॉट ऑफ डिस्कशन इज look at our bowling has raped them. It's the same terminology that's used a lot, and even with partition it's that conquest idea. But maybe there is evidence and anecdotal evidence, but is there also evidence of male rape? Because if the idea is conquest, why is it just women?
See, I don't think there's that much evidence, but I think boys in many countries जिनको पकड़ा जाता है और रखा जाता है for sexual services. So it's, and we know also what happens with trans people also. उनकी bodies को भी, I mean, they are seen to be just available, So, so ये नहीं है कि होता नहीं है. एक तो और भी ज्यादा छिपा हुआ है, और दूसरा हमें अभी मालूम नहीं है कि ये किस तरह के स्केल पे होता है. But I think gradually it is emerging, and one of the conversations that has started to occupy the public arena is precisely this, that the sexual violation of other bodies also. And I think that that is something that we learn about more in due course.
मेरी बहुत अच्छी दोस्त है हिरा ज़हूर, वो आपकी बहुत ही बड़ी फैन है. आई थिंक शी मेट यू एट केएलएफ एज वेल. शी वाज लाइक प्लीज 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 उनसे बोले. उन्होंने एक बहुत अच्छी कहानी सुनाई थी अबाउट टू ट्रांस पीपल हु वर सेपरेटेड बाय पार्टीशन.
हाँ, वो कहानी असल में मेरी एक दोस्त थी जो इस कहानी की रिसर्च के दौरान मुझे मिली थी. उसका नाम था मोना अहमद, और उसको कोई अब 3 या 4 साल हो गए. शी डाइड 80 साल की थी. तो जब मैं पार्टीशन पे काम कर रही थी, बहुत अरसा हो गया, अब तो किताब भी छपे हुए 22 साल हो गए, और मैं भी बूढ़ी हो गई हूँ. तो उस वक्त मुझे ये मेरे दिमाग में ये क्वेश्चन था, ये सवाल था कि मार्जिनलाइज कम्युनिटीज जो हैं उन्होंने कैसे इसको एक्सपीरियंस किया. मतलब कि वो जो रिलीजियस आइडेंटिटी सबसे महान बनाई गई थी, नॉट एवरीबडी फेल्ट दैट वे, नॉट एवरीबडी वांटेड टू एक्सपीरियंस दैट एंड change their lives on the basis of that. So I was looking at communities on the margins, and I was interested in hijras. कि हिजरे जिनके लिए जेंडर इज द बॉर्डर ऑफ आइडेंटिटी, तो उनके लिए ये क्या हुआ. तो मुझे कहानी मेरे सुनने में आई कि दिल्ली में पार्टीशन से पहले एक हिजरा कपल होता था. उनका नाम था सोना और चमन, एंड दे वर लेजेंडरी कपल, वेरी ब्यूटीफुल. और वो हर जगह पे उनको बुलाया जाता था. वो गाते थे, नाचते थे, उनके बहुत से चेले भी थे. और फिर क्या हुआ कि पार्टीशन के टाइम पे उनको अलग होना पड़ा. So Chaman's family, several members of Chaman's family, not Chaman, I'm sorry, Sona's family, several members of Sona's family were apparently killed in the violence of partition. So Sona went to Pakistan, to Lahore, which is where his family were, and Chaman stayed on in India. But for a few years after partition, वो क्या होता था कि हिजरों की जो टोलियां थी, ये सब सुनी हुई कहानी. तो मुझे इसमें सच्चाई कितनी है ये नहीं मालूम. चमन को मैं अच्छी तरह से जानती थी, पर सोना से तो कभी मुलाकात नहीं हुई, सिर्फ कहानी सुनी थी. तो कि हिजरों की जो टोलियां होती थी वो इस बॉर्डर को रिजेक्ट करती, कहती थी हम नहीं मानते कि ये हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान बन गया, क्योंकि हमारी जो कौम है उसकी आइडेंटिटी किसी और ही बेसिस पे बनी हुई है, तो हम इसको एक्सेप्ट नहीं करेंगे. सो यू नो, कुछ सालों के लिए तो पासपोर्ट थे नहीं. सो दे वुड एवरी ईयर टोलियां आती थी, पाकिस्तान से टोली इधर आ जाती थी. फिर वो 8-10 दिन के लिए सब लोग जश्न मनाते थे, गाना बजाना, ये वो सब कुछ, खाना पीना, सोना खरीदना, नए कपड़े खरीदना. और फिर अगले साल टोली पाकिस्तान जाती. फिर कुछ देर के बाद वो बंद हो गया, और कुछ देर के बाद सोना की भी डेथ हो गई. And then Chaman lived on. Chaman died only also 4 years ago. Mona जब मरी है, मोना के 3-4 महीने पहले चमन की डेथ हुई. So Mona was Chaman's chela, Chaman and Sona's chela, head chela. And she remembered, she कहती हूँ because I knew her as a woman. उनकी उम्र पार्टीशन के टाइम पे 11 साल की. So she remembered some things, and she, as I talked with her, तो उनसे ये कहानी मैंने सुनी. और फिर जब चमन से मुलाकात हुई तो चमन ने भी ये कहानी मुझे सुनाई. So that was the story, and I think there must be so many other stories.
Somebody needs to be, जो Netflix पे anthologies बनती रहती हैं movies की. I think this would be such a phenomenal one of those short films to make. And I know it's not hierarchical at all, but it's just layers कि आप जैसे जैसे unpeel करें, it's like an onion, वो layers खुलती रहती हैं कि हर community ने, हर class ने, हर caste ने किस तरह partition को experience किया. बड़ा एक singular state narrative होता है partition का, जो हम बस सुनते आ रहे हैं. जैसे जैसे uncover हो रहा है. आपने दलित की भी बात की थी, and I found that anecdote very interesting. If you'd like to share about के हम तो मुसलमान नहीं, हम तो हिंदू नहीं, हम तो दलित हैं. And I never thought about it like that.
I had also never thought about it like that. वो कहानी असल में मैं शुरुआत मेरे काम की ऐसे हुई कि दो मेरे दोस्त थे, वो एक फिल्म बना रहे थे पार्टीशन पे, पीपल्स मेमोरीज ऑफ पार्टीशन, तो वहां से मुझे आइडिया आया कि मैं इस पे काम करूं. But it wasn't until 1984 in Delhi, when Indira Gandhi was killed, that I really began to think seriously. So उनकी फिल्म के दौरान, which happened roughly around that time, we were interviewing people. I was helping them with research when I met this woman called Maya Rani. And she was a sweeper in a college in a place called Dinanagar, जो कि बॉर्डर के पास में ही है, गुरदासपुर के आसपास कहीं पर है. तो उनसे बात करते करते उन्होंने ये कहानी सुनाई कि उनके विलेज में, दीनानगर में, जब भी एक रूमर फैलता था, क्योंकि बाउंड्री तो 17 तारीख के आसपास डिक्लेयर हुई है ना, पर तो उससे पहले सबको पता था बाउंड्री बनने वाली है, लेकिन nobody knew whether, for example, Lahore would go to India, Pakistan, where would Amritsar go, and especially the border villages. So दीनानगर में भी ये था कि इंडिया को जाएगा या पाकिस्तान को जाएगा. And she was telling me that माया रानी, जब मैं उनसे बात कर रही थी और मैं उनके घर में एक छोटे से कमरे में बैठ के उनसे बात कर रही थी, जो कॉलेज के क्वार्टर्स में कमरा था, और उस कमरे की दीवारें सारी जैसे कि छोटे छोटे घरों में होती है ना, वो पीतल के बर्तनों से बर्तन सारे लाइंड अप थे, और एक कोने में वो रजाइयाँ वगैरह सब कुछ पड़ी हुई थी. तो वो बात मेरे से कर रही थी, तो उन्होंने ये बताया कि दीनानगर में पहले जब रूमर फैलता था कि शायद पाकिस्तान को जाए, तो सब हिंदू अपना सब कुछ छोड़ छाड़ के भाग जाते थे, और कभी रूमर फैलता था कि हिंदुस्तान को जाएगा तो सारे मुसलमान अपना घर छोड़ छाड़ के, सामान छोड़ छाड़ के भाग जाते. तो वो मुझे बताने लगी ये, और कहती कि मैं और मेरी सहेलियां, कोई 4-5 उसकी सहेलियां थी, कि हम सब 16 साल की उम्र के आसपास के थे, और जब भी ऐसे होता था तो हम चुप करके देखते रहते थे, और फिर जैसे ही वो लोग जाते थे उनके घर में छलांग मार के सारा कुछ उठा के वहां से ले आते थे. और उसने कहा, देखो हमने अपना दहेज ऐसे बनाया, ये सारे भांडे बर्तन जो पड़े हैं वो उस टाइम के हैं, और सब कुछ. तो उस बात पे मुझे बहुत हैरानी हुई. फिर मैंने उनसे पूछा कि आपको किसी ने मारने की कोशिश नहीं की? तो फिर उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं, हम तो ना मुसलमान हैं ना हिंदू हैं, हम तो दलित हैं. सो शी यूज्ड द वर्ड हरिजन. उस वक्त हरिजन कहते थे. तो फिर वो बात मेरे दिमाग में बहुत खटकी, बिकॉज like you, I also had not thought of the caste angle of partition. और ये हम लोगों की बहुत एक तरह से इग्नोरेंस है कि हम सोचते, इस चीज को सोचते नहीं, क्योंकि इसके बिना ये कैसे हो सकता था. we should really think about it. So I hadn't thought about it. फिर मैंने उसको एक्सप्लोर करना शुरू किया, and some very very interesting dimensions came up. I mean, I wasn't able to explore it too much, but still, जैसे कि मैंने किताब में लिखा है कि पंजाब, इंडियन पंजाब, जो वेस्ट है कि ईस्ट है, ईस्ट है ना हमारा. Anyway,
वेस्ट होगा ना, because पाकिस्तान is west of
हाँ,
India.
So yeah, so but anyway, so in Indian Punjab, because the west, east and Bengal and Punjab is easier to translate. So वहाँ पर दलितों की population उस time पे it was significant, and also they were a significant political presence, because also they were Dalit leadership and so on. So they also made a demand for a homeland of their own, giving it a geography, giving it a name. So there was that element. Then, this story about the sanitation system of Karachi collapsing because all the Dalits were leaving, waiting for boats to go to Bombay and so on. So ऐसी छोटी छोटी झलकें आई जिनको मैंने लिखा है, but it is an area that actually needs much more exploration, and now some interesting work is happening on looking at caste and partition by people who are much more qualified to do it.
आपने भी जिक्र किया कि उन्होंने भी अपना नेशन मांगा था. If I'm not mistaken, what they called it was Achhutistan. My understanding is Achhut is a pejorative term which is used for them. So is it a re-owning and reappropriating of that term for themselves?
That's what my guess is. I mean, I don't know enough about it because I only saw this in the documents. And my belief is that this kind of, reappropriation, like the word black and
N-word.
Yeah, exactly. I think the meaning of that becomes deep and apparent only when you talk to people who have experienced that and who can tell you how and why it actually happened. So right now I have the name. I got some government documents. I don't even remember now. Consciously, it must have been that. That's my guess.
So maybe this opens a deeper question about identity as well. कि जब जिस तरह जॉन लॉक के बारे में कहते हैं कि जब पहली दफा उसने ईंट रखी और बोला ये मेरी प्रॉपर्टी है, it's a violent act of him owning a property, which means I own this and you necessarily are outside of this. From an ideas perspective, when we do that with identity, even अब बड़ा discussion हो रहा है कि जी LGBTQ आप letters add करे जा रहे हैं without realizing it's a spectrum. You should be inclusive of everything rather than being like, no, we are L, you are G, we are Q, rather than realizing the fluidity of that. So जो ये inherent nature of identity creation है, which might be violent, how do you, I'm sure you've thought about this a lot over the years, how do you respect कि इस इंसान के लिए ये identity बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है, but also realize just there is violence to somebody creating their identity and being like, we're in here and you are outside of that?
See, I think that anything like this, identity is a very complex thing because where does your identity come from? And it comes from birth, it comes from context, it comes from where you live and what you own and what you do and all of those things. Sometimes you want to wipe out that identity if it works against where you want to go in life. And therefore, you own another identity if you can manage to do that. But a lot of the time, you can't manage to do that. Say you want to transition from being a woman to being a man or the other way around, it's not that easy. Up until recently, it has been very difficult, and the physical transformation is not the only thing. So I think that one thing is that identity has to be seen in a context. And I think another thing is that it is it's an evolving thing. It's not a horizon that you can say, I've reached it million, because you might add on other identities. So for me, let me try and explain it in some ways with an example, because that's sometimes easier. If you are a Dalit, it's an act of both power, assertion, anger, and strength, I suppose, to own the very identity that has been used to make you invisible and discriminate against you, which may place you in a violent relationship with others. But that violent relationship is a reflection of something that is historical, which is a cumulative process of oppression and rendering you invisible, right? So I think the violence comes with it for reasons when it does come with it. It's not always the case. And we have to understand it in that context of history. And we have to understand ourselves also. So if I come from privilege and I don't understand that violence, and I think, I'm very egalitarian, I'm very liberal, etc., etc. I'm being nice to this person. Why is this person being awful to me? But for that person, I'm not me, the individual person, but I am me who represents some form of historical whatever the word is. I don't want to use the word oppression, but I think that's what it is. I mean, in many ways, because of who I am, where I am, I'm complicit in that. So I have to understand that also. So I think that if we are to understand the inequalities and hierarchies and the deep inequalities and hierarchies which are sedimented so deeply in our society, then we'll understand that anger and that violence also. We need to find ways of dealing with it. It's not that easy. You know, I'm also, let me take another example. I'm also a teacher. I teach, I'm not a regular teacher, but I teach young students at a couple of universities. And I teach them courses in feminism and the women's movement in India. One of the things I find is that young people of a certain class, they're all fairly privileged to come to those universities. Men and women, they're very curious about feminism, about women, about gender, because they are seeing it all around them and they want questions answered. One of their constant questions is, especially the guys, we are just trying to be nice to the women. But how do we know when we cross the line? Why do they get so angry with us? And I think it's a very genuine question, but they also need to understand why the women react with anger. So you might be doing something that you think is being very helpful and being nice. The other person is experiencing it as being patronizing or an exercise of power, however small, etc. And they will react with anger. They will react with hurt. These are negotiations that I think we really need to try and understand, both in terms of history and in terms of our society. Otherwise, the differences will be too deep.
It's जहाँ से आपने privilege की बात की, I think that's spot on. It's what vantage point you're seeing something from. Even on an academic level, a lot of people talk about post-identity societies. Or if you look at India and Pakistan and you're trying to whitewash it into क्या जरूरत थी religion की basis पे बनाने की, ठीक है, लेकिन जिस इंसान के लिए वो आइडेंटिटी इतनी इंपॉर्टेंट है, जिस तरह आपने ट्रांस का जिक्र किया, एकेडमिकली आप मान सकते हैं जेंडर बाइनरी है, फॉल्स है, नहीं होनी चाहिए, जेंडर स्पेक्ट्रम है, लेकिन अगर एक ट्रांस इंसान है जिसकी अंदर जात से वो कहते, if you talk to a lot of trans people in Pakistan as well, especially men who transition to women, for them to be recognized as women, for you to look at that person and be like, yes, you are a woman, what that means to that person, it's everything. They're like, मैं अपने soul से एक औरत हूँ. So yes, you can academically say gender binary doesn't exist, but that woman identity for that individual, similarly the religious identity for a Muslim who wanted partition, to be conscious of that while at the same time maybe have that discussion के ये identity creation की वजह से जो violence आया है, it's a difficult tightrope to traverse at times.
It's a very difficult tightrope to traverse, and I think that there's suspicion also on one side and there's anger on the other side, and somewhere you have to learn to negotiate. You know, my friend Mona, who I mentioned to you, so Mona was a man till she was 18, and then she initially she joined the Hijras and had herself castrated. Later she had some kind of sexual reassignment surgery, what it was called at that time. लेकिन उस वक्त वो होती भी नहीं थी, तो उन्होंने जो भी कराया, but eventually she had a woman's body, and she so strongly felt that she wanted to be a woman. But it was also very interesting because it's not something that once she had crossed that line and occupied that identity, it wasn't as if she wanted necessarily to stay in that fixity. So she also sometimes felt like a man, and she played that role. And for me, who was her friend, it became so natural to see this flexibility and everything that I never thought twice about it. और कभी कभी ऐसे होता था कि उनका नेव्यू उनके साथ कभी कभी रहता था, उसका नाम था नासिर, उसका नाम है नासिर. तो कभी कभी नासिर और मोना और मैं बैठ के बातें करते थे. And for Nasir, Mona was his mama. mother's brother. So he called Mona Mamu and referred to her as he. I called her she and referred to her as she. She called herself hum. And she said, हम ये जा रहे हैं, मैं ये कर रहे हैं. And the three of us would have this conversation perfectly normal. You know, उसमें कुछ हमको लगता ही नहीं था कि कोई अजीब चीज है. So I'm just saying that in a sense, once you see it as not something out of the ordinary, the spectrum, the flexibility, the ana jana, but it does raise a lot of problems because, and especially among feminists these days, I mean, as you know, there is a big debate on, can trans women, हाँ, वो सब चल रहा है अभी. और मुझे ये भी याद है कि 2006 में हम लोग, यहाँ इंडिया में हम लोग करते थे हर 4 साल के बाद एक वुमेन्स मूवमेंट कॉन्फ्रेंस, which was an unfunded, और बहुत लोग आते थे. तो 2006 में हमने कलकत्ता में की थी और वहाँ पे कोई 2-2,500 लोग थे. And we always used to take like a college or something, और सब वहीं सो जाते थे जमीन पे. And this was the first time that trans women came into that. And वहाँ पे जो औरतें इकट्ठी हुई थी, उनमें सब में कईयों में ये डाउट था कि can we allow these people to be in the same space as us? क्या ये तो असल में आदमी हैं, क्या ये औरतें हैं? वो चीज आज के माहौल में उस तरह के डाउट्स नहीं होंगे क्योंकि the discussion has moved much further. लेकिन और भी आ जाते हैं.
But हैं टर्फ्स जिनको कहते हैं, जेके राउलिंग ये काफी पॉपुलर टर्फ हैं, एंड उसमें भी यही है कि डिह्यूमनाइजिंग है ना. अगर आपकी ऑब्वियसली नहीं होगी, बट अगर आपके फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट कोई दोस्त भी हैं जो टर्फ हैं, if they meet a friend of yours, let's say if years ago they were to meet Mona and you were like, Mona will also come and sleep with us, they'll be like, हाँ ठीक है, ये तो मोना है. वो फिर एक इंसान की तरह देखते हैं. Once they get to know people and talk to them, then they're like, obviously, मतलब we've interacted with this person can come. But फिर वो जब अमेरिका में ये बहुत सारी ये अमेरिका ने ये डिबेट्स खराब किए हैं, दैट बाथरूम डिबेट एंड स्टफ. एंड अगेन ये शायद कॉलोनियलिज्म की तरफ चला जाएगा, बट जो उनकी एक इंसेसेंट नीड ऑफ कैटेगराइजेशन है, एंड अ लॉट ऑफ, नॉट टू इरेज हमारे खुद के मसले मसाइल, but a lot of these distinctions, these are Muslim, they will speak Urdu, these are Hindus, they will speak Hindi, no, you are different, this is what Muslims do, this is what Hindus do. That's a lot of the colonial project that we don't really think of it as such.
Mona told me a lovely story once about herself. I'll just tell you that. So she was deeply unhappy at some point in her life and she decided कि मैं हज पे जाऊंगी. एक ग्रुप जा रहा था तो वो साथ में गई, तो उसने मुझे बताया कि मैं गई. तो मैंने उनसे पूछा कि आप हज पे कैसे गए? अकेले गए? क्योंकि आप अगर औरत हो तो अकेले नहीं जा सकते. She said, नहीं, मैं तो, मेरा पासपोर्ट था आदमी के नाम में, मैं आदमी बन के गई. वो मर्दाने कपड़े पहन लेती थी, सफारी सूट वगैरह एंड ऑल ऑफ दैट, सो आई सेड अच्छा. फिर उस वक्त मैं उनको इतनी अच्छी तरह से जानती नहीं थी, बट मेरे दिमाग में बहुत से सवाल थे, बट आई डिडंट वांट टू आस्क हर. Once I got to know her better, I asked her, I said, आपने मुझे एक बार बताया था कि आप हज पे गए थे, तो आप मर्द बन के गए थे, तो आप फिर वहाँ पे रुके कहाँ, रात को सोए कहाँ? मर्दाने क्वार्टर में कि जनाने क्वार्टर में? She said, मर्दाने क्वार्टर में. So I thought, अच्छा. फिर मैंने, क्योंकि उनकी बॉडी तो अब फीमेल बॉडी थी ना, so then I said, तो फिर जब आपको टॉयलेट वगैरह जाना था तो कहाँ गए? She said, जनाने क्वार्टर में. इसलिए ये कैसे हो सकता है कि आप मर्दाने क्वार्टर से उठ के जनाने क्वार्टर में टॉयलेट जाते हैं? शी सेड, देखो आप लोग समझते नहीं हो कुछ. मैं वहां पे गई, जनानियों ने मुझसे कुछ पूछा तो मैंने ऐसे ताली बजा दी और उनको पता चल गया कि मैं कौन हूँ. वो हिजरे की ताली जो, उन्होंने कुछ नहीं कहा मुझे. So just the acceptance and the tolerance and the ingenious nature of negotiating the space between the identities, I found that really pretty amazing.
It's interesting कि TERFs जो होती हैं, trans exclusionary radical feminists, it's interesting where they're coming from, because a lot of the discussion in America about bathroom is again same ideas. It's led by men. Okay, these men who pretend to be women will go into the bathrooms of our women and our children. हमारे अपनी बेटी बीवियों की इज्जत प्रोटेक्ट करनी है, इसलिए हम बाथरूम बिल्स ला रहे हैं. It comes from that same male we own these women and we need to protect them idea.
हाँ, वो तो है. I think, I don't know, these are very difficult things. Abhi, I'm seeing also in the university where I teach at Ashoka, they are also now trying to set up like infrastructure, like gender neutral toilets and so on. तो इन चीज़ों के बारे में मेरे ख्याल हमको काफ़ी सोचना चाहिए, और काफ़ी जिस कम्युनिटी को ये अफेक्ट करती है उनके साथ बात करके फिर देखना चाहिए कि क्या तरीका हो सकता है जो सबसे अच्छा.
With gender, this fluidity of identity हम लोग easily देख सकते हैं, क्योंकि आपने कहा कि वो किसी को मामू कहते थे, तो हम आपके मामू का भी जिक्र करेंगे कि वो religious identity भी जब आप उनका जिक्र करती हैं, there is not that finality to it that he converted, yes, but he kept a lot of the same traits. वो नाम से शायद अगर मुसलमान हो, but a lot of practices are still kept like that. So can we also think of these religious identities as a lot more fluid than the colonial categorization model?
See, I think they're always fluid. And I think that they are turned into by some instrumentalization and some political manipulation. And not to say that people are easily politically manipulated, but if they see their own advantage also in it, then they are turned into something rigid. But otherwise, in itself, no religion is rigid like that. I'm not a religious person at all. But my family, so my father's family was a Sikh family. But they were the kind of Sikhs जो पंजाबी और सिख पंजाब में जो होते हैं, जो कि एक्चुअली हिंदू फैमिलीज होती हैं, लेकिन वो अपने सबसे बड़ा बेटा जो है ना उसको सिखिज्म को दे देते हैं. तो उनकी फैमिली में my father was the eldest, so he was Joginder Singh Butalia, like a Sikh name, and all his brothers were Adesh Chandar, Ramesh Chandar, etc. etc. तो अगर हम किसी मजहब को मानते थे, that was Sikhism. But what did we like about it? We seldom went to the Gurdwara to pray or anything. But we always went there to help with the seva, the langar, the cleaning. My grandmother used to go and make chapatis in the langar the whole time. And we just loved it, पीछे जाके बड़े सारे किचन में बच्चे बैठे हुए हैं दादी के साथ, और बड़े बड़े तवों पे रोटियां बना रहे हैं, etc. Now, you might say that we are Sikhs by religion, but actually there was nothing really there. And I find, although I have never really prayed, and if I was to pray, I would go into a Sikh Gurdwara, I would not go into a Hindu temple. And yet I find Hinduism infinitely interesting in its many complexities. And I have often gone into a masjid and a church and found the sukoon you get over there really quite wonderful, quite amazing. तो ये क्या चीज होती है? There isn't really any religion which is telling you that you have to be tied into this thing and you can't step out of it, or you can't interact with others.
There's peace in being in a place which gives you that idea of community being more than yourself. मैं दिल्ली आया था तो मेरे एक दोस्त बने वहाँ हरदीप सिंह, वो मुझे दिल्ली में गुरुद्वारे लेकर गए थे, and we went at like 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. वाले time. It was so peaceful. उनके वो बेसमेंट में ही वो खाने वाने बना रहे थे नाश्ता लोगों के लिए. ना किसी ने पूछा मेरा मजहब क्या है, मैं कौन हूँ, सब उतने ही प्यार और तखल्लुस से मिले. There's something special in even Delhi पे. उससे पहले हम जब गए थे निजामुद्दीन के मज़ार पे, मुसलमान तो नहीं आते वहाँ, सब आते हैं. And there's something special to that we need to hold on to.
Exactly. And there's a friend of mine from Lahore, she passed away some years ago, आपने शायद नाम सुना होगा, Lala Rukh. She was quite a well-known artist. So Lala को 3 साल के लिए, because she was over the age of 60, she got a multiple entry visa to India. So she said मैंने आना है, तो मैंने कहा तो आ जा. And उसका जो उसके मन में एक ख्वाहिश थी, she wanted to visit the Golden Temple. in Amritsar.
Amritsar.
So she crossed over the border. I went to pick her up and we went straight to the Gurdwara because असल में हमको उसको अमृतसर का वीजा नहीं मिला था, दिल्ली का मिला था. But legally you can be there as long as you don't spend
travel through. I think that's the law.
And as long as you don't spend the night there. So we booked a flight out late at night and we went to the Gurdwara. और वो जो गुरुद्वारा है उसमें at any given time तकरीबन 1 लाख लोग होते हैं. You know, just doing the walking around the tank and praying and everything. लेकिन उसमें कोई शोर शराबा नहीं होता है. It's just people are doing their own thing. They are praying. It's peaceful. And there are areas there where you have total silence. And Lala was completely transfixed. So we spent like, I think, 5-6 hours just in different parts of the Gurdwara. And then we got onto a flight and came to Delhi. But she just loved it and found it really quite beautiful. So I think it's the same thing everywhere. You know.
Unfortunately, there's also a flip side to that beauty. Like Jinnah came to a moment where he was like, no matter what I do, they will always see me as a Muslim. And when you talk about 1984, I think you also mentioned that your father didn't wear a turban. But was there a realization, जिस तरह अगर मैं न्यूयॉर्क भी जाता हूँ, I was doing my masters over there, मैंने कभी अपनी को मुस्लिम आइडेंटिटी मेरी स्लीव पे नहीं पहनी. लेकिन अगर अमेरिका में कोई इस्लामोफोबिक अटैक होता था, I felt that personally, I'd go with the communities. So in 1984, did you feel that way as well, that other people see me as a Sikh, even if I don't necessarily see myself like that?
So yes and no. See, the thing is that in appearance, my father in 1984, you couldn't tell because he was bald, so you couldn't tell. And my brothers both have short hair. And my sister and I mean, we could be Sikh, we could be Hindu, we could be Muslim. Nobody can really tell. शक्ल से वो आदमियों का पता चलता था पगड़ी से. या अगर आप बहुत religious हो as a woman and you're carrying a kirpan or you're wearing your particular types of clothes, तब पता चलता था. वैसे तो पता नहीं चलता.
नाम से भी पता चल सकता है.
नाम से पता चलता है. So Butalia is a Sikh name, but it is not such a widely known Sikh name. It's an unusual name because it actually comes from the village near Gujranwala, Butala. And people from that village, many people from that village, took the village name as opposed to the caste name. So if it had been the caste name, which I don't know what it would have been, Aroda or some nonsense like that, I'm very glad they didn't take it. But if it had been that name, I suppose it might have been easier to tell. Nevertheless, we did feel a sense of vulnerability at that time, which we had never felt before, because by the name we could be identified. And second, we also felt a sense of solidarity and wanting to own that identity, the same thing that you referred to earlier, which also had never been part of our thinking before. I mean, I told you that we used to go to the Gurdwara and all that, but it was like a, it was a game and it was nice and all of that, but it was not what it was for my grandmother. For my grandmother, it was a way of life. हमारे लिए मौका था, कभी जाओ, कभी कड़ा प्रसाद खा लो, कभी ये कर लो, वो कर लो. Nothing major like that. And as an adult, later I found the teachings of Sikhism to be quite interesting. But that's more like, when you start really looking at something in a different way. But at that time, yes, we did feel both a vulnerability and a sense of solidarity and wanting to own that identity.
So when you talk to a lot of people in 1947, I'm assuming the feeling would be similar in those accounts.
Of
this same idea that even people who didn't maybe see themselves as Muslims or Hindus and saw themselves कि हम तो communities में साथ ही रहते हैं, but वो जब एक eruption हुआ, that realization that मैं जो भी हूँ, other people see me as a Muslim or other people see me as a Hindu, and the vulnerability that comes from there.
Yeah, I think so. there was that. Now that you mention it, I'm thinking back on the people that I talked to and the way they experienced that. I think there was a very deep sense among many people of hurt on both sides, because suddenly there was, I mean, just as there were deep friendships also, but there was also deep betrayals. So people were very hurt by those betrayals, and they happened on both sides. There was also a sense of confusion and bewilderment, that this identity was not something, it wasn't absent, but it wasn't paramount.
It's a great way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it.
So, मतलब it wasn't absent in the, आप देखते थे कि जब इवेंट्स होते थे, शादियां होती थी, लोग मिलते जुलते थे, लेकिन वो बॉर्डर्स क्लियर थे कि खाना नहीं है इस घर में, या ये नहीं करना है, वो नहीं करना है, ये सब नहीं होता था. So it's never absent, and that inequality built into it, I think in these daily differences, it gets reiterated all the time. So somewhere cumulatively, I think it's adding to the hurt, and then it comes out or explodes at a particular time. So I think that there was a lot of bewilderment among people कि ये हुआ कैसे. And there was also, of course, this, anger that it was the British who did it. It was the Sarkar who did it. वो सब भी था.
So आप जब कहती हैं कि there are no good or bad people in partition, is there any way for us to almost empathize के जो हो रहा था, जिसकी वजह से लोगों ने violence भी commit किया? Is there a way of framing where we also have some empathy that violence is a reaction to violence?
That's a tough one.
So,
in a sense, Shahzad, it's easy for you and me to say that. Because we have not seen or felt or experienced that violence. If you've experienced it, it's not so easy. It's like, earlier when we were talking, you made a reference to the death penalty when you're talking of sexual violation. So what happens when somebody's child is sexually violated? They want the death penalty for the perpetrator. They want the perpetrator to be killed. And even though you and I might cry ourselves blue in the face and say death penalty से कुछ नहीं बदलता है, जो कि सच है बात. उससे कुछ नहीं बदलता है, वो कोई deterrent नहीं है. Justice should not be, punitive. It should be retributive, it should be redemptive, ये वो. लेकिन उस इंसान का गुस्सा, उस इंसान की चोट को आप कैसे देख सकते हो? So I'm always reluctant to say that, only because I think that we can say it because we are sitting in a position where we haven't felt that. But I think it's also, there have been so many examples in history where attempts have been made to try and deal with this and to try and understand the perpetrators. And I'm not thinking only of the, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions or the ways in which Latin American countries like Peru and other places set up commissions to look into this, or the ways in which Rwanda and other places have dealt with it. But I'm thinking also, I was listening on Sunday to ये 1947 Partition archive है, वो कुछ कर रहे हैं Sunday stories, तो उसमें मैं एक पाकिस्तानी शख्स हैं, उनकी कहानी सुन रही थी कि, and I unfortunately didn't get the complete story because I entered late, but the story was that he came to India to find the killers of his father, and he found their family, and basically वो जो encounter हुआ, उसमें he was able to put a closure and reconcile himself. So somewhere the question you're asking possibly can offer us a way forward to understand and to heal But it's not at all an easy question. And in order to deal with it or to enter that terrain, I think you have to be both empathetic, historical, non-judgmental, etc., which unfortunately our countries and our politicians are not.
The understanding and healing is what I was getting at. I never wanted to venture into apologia. For instance, when we talk about child abuse, anybody who abuses a child is a monster, deserves punishment. But when people talk about, oh, when I was abused as a child, so you also need to find out a way to break that cycle of abuse, not to exonerate that particular abuser, but to understand the phenomena. So when people talk about partition in Pakistan or India probably, but agar main apni baat karoon, it's hard for them to grasp that idea that this grandfather जिनकी मैं गोद में खेला हूँ और ये बहुत प्यार करते हैं और कितने खूबसूरत आदमी है सबके, he might have murdered people. And there are people जिनके घरों में तलवारें रखी हुई हैं खून से भरी हुई. I mean बहुत rare ऐसे हैं, but insist just that truth and reconciliation even for an individual के at a time like this man that I love could have committed this, and maybe if a time similar happens, my brother or my father or men in my family who are similar will also be like this. How do we prevent that?
That's a really difficult thing to come to terms with, and I don't know how any of us can. You know, when I was working on my book, the first time I came across somebody like this. So वो एक अमृतसर में रहते थे. मैंने इसके किताब में लिखा है, his name is मंगल सिंह. अब तो उनकी डेथ हो गई होगी, बहुत अरसा हो गया. So everybody told me, ये कहानी सबको मालूम होती है आसपास. So वहाँ पे मार्केट में, गुरुद्वारे में, चाय वाले के पास, इधर उधर सब लोग मुझे कहें कि आप पार्टीशन की कहानियां ढूंढ रहे हो, आप मंगल सिंह से जाके बात कीजिए. उन्होंने और उनके 2 भाइयों ने अपनी फैमिली के 18 लोग मारे थे, 18-19 लोग मारे थे, मोस्टली women and children. And this was like seen like a heroic kind of act. And I was really reluctant to go and see, because I couldn't bring myself to face him for the same sort of reason that you're talking. Finally, I was persuaded to go, or मैं गई, and I was surprised to meet a really nice old man, who basically he had a new family. मतलब new तो नहीं, मैं 40 साल हो गए थे तो, but he had left behind his entire family, killed people and come away, and I didn't know what to make of it. वो मुझे ये पूरी कहानी उन्होंने सुनाई और रो के सुनाई, और मुझे भी उनके साथ रोना आया, लेकिन मुझे समझ नहीं आया कि इसके साथ कैसे डील करूं, because basically he's a murderer, so it was very interesting. उन्होंने जो लैंग्वेज यूज की, जब कैमरा नहीं था उनके ऊपर, तो वो उन्होंने कहा कि हाँ उनको हमने मार दिया, but with the camera he said वो शहीद हो गए, because he didn't want to also admit it, and then he wanted to cast it in that mold of honor. And at some point I asked him, I said कि आपने ये सब कुछ भुलाया कैसे, इतना गम आप लेके आए वहां से अपने दिल के ऊपर, तो इसको आपने भुलाया कैसे? And he said, जब हम लोग यहाँ पे आए बेटा उस वक्त तो मैं बच्ची थी, he said कि ये ना एक what's the word he used, कोरे कागज की तरह थी ये जगह. कोरा कागज था जिसपे हमने अपनी जिंदगी की लकीरें डाली और जिंदगी दोबारा से बनाई. लेकिन वो तो ये घर है जो आप देख रहे हो, पर से कि आप ये पंजाब जो है, and he said it in Punjabi, he said ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਦੇਖੋ, ਪੰਜਾਬ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਹੈਗਾ, ਇਹਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੋਨੇ ਦੀ ਚਿੜੀਆ. You understand Punjab?
Yes.
So he said ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੋਨੇ ਦੀ ਚਿੜੀਆ. इस ज़मीन च ਅਸੀਂ अपने सारे अंजू पा देते हैं. We wept into, we put all our tears, all our forgetting, all our grief into this land, and it has given us back. ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸੋਨਾ ਲੁਟਾਇਆ ਹੈ. सारा कुछ असी जेड़ा भुलाना चाहते सी असी अपने अंजुआं नाल इस जमीन नूं सींचिया है. We've irrigated this land with our tears. And that's how I have been able to forget. And then he took me to the Golden Temple, where in the wall at the entrance, they had the names of all the family members that they had died, who had been killed. I still, so many years later, I don't know what to make of this, because the overwhelming sense that I carried away was of somebody very grieved, carrying this burden. But my rational self kept telling me, but this man's a killer. And I've still not been able to figure out, how does one deal with this? What do you do?
It reminded me of Amrita Pritam's poem Waris Shah as well. The idea ke Ajaka Waris Shah nu kitnu kabra vich kuch bol ke ban. One here cried, you wrote so much, and Ravi is full of dead bodies today, and you're silent. Where are you, Waris Shah?
Mohi हीर पंजाब दी तू enna chitta something. And
आज लाखा रोई मेरी मैं सिंधी हूँ एक्चुअली. आई लिव्ड इन लाहौर, तो मुझे पंजाबी समझ में आ जाती है, लेकिन मैं बोलने की कोशिश नहीं करता, क्योंकि फिर जो पंजाबी स्पीकर्स है ना, मुझे बहुत गालियां देते हैं कि तुम कोशिश भी क्यों कर रहे हो. बट इट्स माय थर्ड लैंग्वेज एट दिस पॉइंट, सो थोड़ा क्रेडिट दे दिया करें मुझे कि मैं समझ भी लेता हूँ. एंड बट आई थिंक इट्स गुड दैट एटलीस्ट वो नाम लिखे हुए हैं. ये शायद मेरी इग्नोरेंस हो, बट मुझे इतना नहीं पता कि पाकिस्तान में कोई ऐसी जगह है जहां हम बात भी करते हैं. बिकॉज आई थिंक विद द पार्टीशन नैरेटिव, एंड आई एम जनरलाइजिंग, there is still a sense of loss in India, that we lost something. But the predominant narrative in Pakistan is one of triumph, is one of independence, is one of freedom, which doesn't leave much space for grief. So it's maybe much harder for people in Pakistan to grieve about 1947, because national narrative is not so strong about celebration.
See, Shahzad, I think you're wrong.
Okay.
I think that is what it was. There's no doubt that is what it was, and it's not surprising, because while Pakistan became a nation at that time, and therefore it was the birth of a nation, and therefore it was a triumphalist narrative, bound to be, India lost a part of itself. So it was a narrative of loss, and therefore it became easier to enter that narrative if you were looking at people's memories, because wo bhi dukh bhari baatein thi, quite a lot of them, right? Lekin I have found over the years, listening to people speak in Pakistan about partition, and I think almost every time I have been there, other than the initial few years when I went to spend time with my family, but in last few times I have gone, it's always been for literary festivals and other things. Har jagah pe partition ki jab baat hoti hai, there is also a sense of loss, not necessarily loss of property or whatever it is, but a loss of friendships, a loss of certain ways of life. And also because our governments have kept those borders so rigid and kept the impossibility of friendships across borders, that people actually see the irrationality of it, and they want to maintain those friendships. And as means of communication have changed, we know that those are possible. So I think on both sides there is change. I have also, in the last few years, various friends of mine have asked me to speak to young Pakistani students. So the net gives us this possibility कि हम जो visas हमें रोक देते हैं, तो हम एक दूसरे के net के जरिए बात कर सकते हैं. And I have found the curiosity among students in Pakistan to explore the memories of their grandparents about partition, and to explore them not as narratives of triumph, but just as narratives of a moment in our history, which we are all struggling to understand. So I think there is a change over there.
I'm sure there's
Yes,
progress, Ji.
yeah, there is, yeah, and also you see, you had Anam speaking on your show some time back, huh? And she was talking about her work and the work of the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. Very important work. There's so many memories of partition over there. And that's, you see the work of the 1947 Partition Archive, whose scholars who do the interviews are all young people, the ones who are doing it in Pakistan I'm talking about. They're all interested, they're exploring such interesting stories. और जैसे हमारे यहाँ हो रहा है कि इनिशियल फोकस ऑन पंजाब, उसके बाद बंगाल, अब वो जगह जगह फैल रहा है। लद्दाख पे रिसर्च हो रही है, गुजरात पे बन्नी पे रिसर्च हो रही है, खासी हिल्स पे रिसर्च हो रही है, आपके यहाँ भी the research is now moving to other parts of the country, also moving from Punjab to other parts and other areas. So I think this is a process, like a historical process where certain kinds of explorations become possible and important at certain times for a variety of reasons. And once those open up, then, it's like और layers उसके खुलते रहते हैं. And I think in both our countries, in all three countries, Bangladesh also, and in the diaspora, we are at that. Diaspora में हमारे कितने बच्चे हैं जो एक दूसरे से मिलते हैं. मेरा नेव्यू है जो ऑक्सफोर्ड में पढ़ता है, उसका सबसे करीबी दोस्त एक पाकिस्तानी लड़का है, और वहाँ पर अच्छी खासी दोस्ती है जो कि एक दूसरे के मुल्क में वो नहीं कर सकेंगे. So who knows, they might end up doing something together,
It's interesting ना कि यहाँ बैठ के हम आर्ग्यू करते हैं कि हम सबसे अलग हैं, हम तो कभी नहीं साथ रह सकते थे. फिर आप इंटरनेशनल जहां भी जाते हैं, नेचुरल एक रेजोनेंस, जिस तरह ग्रेविटी होती है ना मून और अर्थ की, you see somebody desi and you just naturally gravitate towards that person, and then you live together, you even watch cricket together. छोटे छोटे मसलों में हम फंस जाते हैं. हम जब दिल्ली जा रहे थे, हमें वो so I went for a competition at New Law University, NLU, Delhi में. And they were like, हमें बोला गया था cricket loves नहीं mention होगा because ये बड़ा fissure हो सकता है इससे. And once we started talking about cricket, that's where we bonded over. और जो organizers थे, they had mentioned to the students of the university के cricket की बात नहीं करना, जबकि हमने unite ही सारा cricket के ऊपर किया. There is definitely progress. It's just a lot of these literary circles and academic work is still niche, unfortunately. I'm sure there's growth. And also there's a difference. People who experience partition, I think they have a lot more nuance. They have a lot more holistic perspective. There's space for triumph and grief. But जो ये nationalistic एक project है और ये थोड़ा सा accelerate हो गया in the current regime, जो hybrid regime है, उधर जिस तरह 1971 पे कॉन्फ्रेंस हो रही थी लम्स में, वो बैन करती गई. थोड़े सेशंस हो रहे थे कई साल पहले, आई एम श्योर यू नो सबीन महमूद. बलूचिस्तान पे एक सेशन था, वो बैन कर दिया गया. तो ऑब्वियसली रेजिस्टेंस भी होगी और क्यूरियोसिटी तो हमेशा रहेगी, बट स्टेट भी अपनी तरफ से बड़ी कोशिशें कर रहा है इन चीजों को दबाने की.
जगह पे ये होता है, हर जगह पे ये होता है. मैं कराची में गई थी आई थिंक कुछ साल पहले लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल पे, एंड इट वाज ऑर्गेनाइज्ड बाय OUP, और उसमें हम 4 of us Indian authors were invited by our own government, the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. They had financed our trip. I mean, we were invited by the festival, but our trip was financed everything by the ICCR. Or Karachi festival organizers ne very nicely, they had put the logo of the ICCR in among all the partners, which is normal अगर वो किसी को support करते हैं तो. And यहाँ के मीडिया में I didn't even know, क्योंकि हमारे फोन तो वहाँ काम नहीं करते हैं, और I was not looking at the net. Huge things started off कि अरे ये 4 writers enemy country में चले गए हैं और ये हो रहा है, वो हो रहा है, सब कुछ हो रहा है. फिर मुझे वो एक मेरी लाहौर में फ्रेंड है, उसने मुझे फोन करके बोला कि तुझे पता है ये क्या हो रहा है सारा कुछ. But we just ignored it. By the time we came home, it was over. But still, it's हर जगह पे क्या जरूरत पड़ती.
अनफॉर्चुनेटली अर्नब जर्नलिज्म हमने भी इम्पोर्ट कर लिया है. अगर किसी की तस्वीर भी हो ना, किसी पॉलिटिकल एक्टिविस्ट की, जर्नलिस्ट की, विद इन इंडियन, इंटरनेशनली इंडिया में ना भी हो, इट्स शोन एज एविडेंस की ये देखें ये रॉ फंडेड है, बिकॉज इसने इसके साथ जो तस्वीर खिंचाई है, इसके जो मामू थे वो एक दिन कॉन्फ्रेंस पे गए थे जिनकी बहन एक्चुअली रॉ में काम करती हैं, तो वो पूरा ताना बाना बनाकर दे ट्राई एंड प्रूव कि ये जर्नलिस्ट और एक्टिविस्ट सारे के सारे फंडेड है. So when we talk about partition, it's so tough to talk about these things, but every time I listen to you talk, there's so much humor in it as well. Is that a conscious decision where you're like, ये बातें ह्यूमर थोड़ा इनको पैलेटेबल बना देती है, और इज दैट जस्ट योर पर्सनालिटी?
नहीं, मैंने तो ये सोचा ही नहीं कभी. आई थिंक मतलब थोड़ी सी मजाकिया तो मैं हूँ, पर इतनी ज्यादा भी नहीं. In fact, I'm accused of being the opposite, too serious sometimes, but could be. See, the thing is, शहजाद, मैंने जब मैंने वो 10 साल लगाए थे पार्टीशन पे काम करने, उस वक्त जो कहानियां मैं सुन रही थी, I don't think that I have ever wept as much as I wept during that time. हर कहानी सुन के रोना आ जाता. And it became, the process became very burdensome in a sense, क्योंकि जिन लोगों के साथ मैं बातें कर रही थी, उन्होंने भी इतने अरसे से किसी से बात नहीं की थी, या बात की थी लेकिन सुनवाई नहीं हुई थी उस बात की. और यहाँ पे कोई आके उनसे कह रहा था कि अच्छा मुझे अपनी कहानी सुनाइए, मैं सुनना चाहती हूँ. You know, it's different from just talking. Even with my mother, वो सारा टाइम अपने भाई की बात करती थी, मैंने कभी उसको सुना नहीं. जब मैंने 84 के बाद काम शुरू किया, तब मैं उनके पास गई और मैंने उनसे कहा कि आप मामे की कहानी फिर से सुनाइए. एंड शी वाज आल्सो सरप्राइज्ड कि क्या हो गया, यू नो. सो वो कहानियां सुन सुन के एक तरह से बहुत बोझ लगा कि क्या करो इस नॉलेज के साथ, यू नो. एंड ऑल्सो इट्स लाइक इट मेक्स यू थिंक अबाउट how can human beings be so cruel to each other? How can they do this to each other? So for me, it had become quite difficult at a time. And then मेरी बहुत सी सहेलियां थी, मैंने उनके साथ एक दिन बैठ के बात की, because one of the ways I do things is to talk about them with my friends. And one of them said to me कि चल मैं तेरे साथ थोड़ी मदद करती हूँ तुझे. So for about 2 years, she joined with me. Her name was Sudesh Vaid. And that made a huge difference. So हम जाते थे किसी से जाके 2-3-4 घंटे बैठ के इंटरव्यू करते थे, उसके बाद हम किसी ढाबे में जाके रोटी और दाल खाते थे और गप्पे लगाते थे और थोड़ा हंस लेते थे. So it made a huge difference to me. Then Sudesh was unable to continue because she got cancer and became quite ill. तो फिर मुझे दोबारा से करना पड़ा. But I think that after the writing of that book, somehow I managed to, I don't know, be at peace with myself about the stories, because जैसे आपने अभी कहा कि अगर आप पार्टीशन के सर्वाइवर्स के साथ बात करें, what comes out also, and what was very surprising to me was that despite having faced so much violence, there was also so much compassion. You know, so much understanding of what had happened and no desire for revenge. I didn't meet anyone in the people I talked to who was thirsting for revenge. There was one person who had faced a really difficult time, but he had kind of, you know, gone to the Golden Temple, और वो रोज वहां जाके कर सेवा करते थे, which was his way of coming to terms with what had happened. So I suppose that in a sense, having lived through that shared grief, I was able to maybe come out of it with a bit of lightness and humor. I don't know. But
it's the only way to survive, I think. I'm a stand-up comedian as well, and humor अगर नहीं होता मेरी जिंदगी में, I don't know where I would have been without it. It's been a coping mechanism. It's been a defense mechanism, even if it's been really unhealthy for me at times. but survival mode में whatever keeps you alive is more important. In terms of this empathy as well, जिस तरह आपने अभी उनकी बात की, मनाल सिंह जो थे, do you feel कि ये empathy develop आपके पर्सनल रिलेशनशिप से भी हुई? कि अगर आपने कहा कि मामी की कहानी सुनाए, you maybe grown up thinking of him as the bad guy, as the villain, किसने प्रॉपर्टी भी हड़प ली, हमें नानी से भी दूर रखा, and then you go to Lahore and he's like, नहीं आप तो हमारी बेटी हैं, आप फैमिली, आप घर में, and you're like, ये तो बुगी मैन था, how is he being loving to me?
Yeah, I think there is that. I think it's also the realization कि आपको जो भी आपने सुना है वो आप सुन लें, लेकिन आपको जजमेंट अपनी एक्सरसाइज करनी है. सो क्योंकि मेरी माँ की कहानियां उनके बारे में जो थी, उनमें ही was the bogeyman, he was the bad guy, and even though she had a lot of affection for him because he was her younger brother, but still she felt, because she had experienced that direct thing. You know, she had gone there to fetch him. He didn't come. He kept my grandmother back. सब कुछ. तो जब मैं उनसे मिली, I carried all that with me, but I didn't actually want to let that influence the way I looked at him. And I wanted to listen to his side of the story. And when he told me his side of the story, it was as credible as my mother's side of the story. And it made me realize that, you know, how history can look so different from where you're placed. To two different people, to two different countries. I don't know. So I think that one of the things, I mean, to answer the question I think that you are asking, one of the things that I have always been grateful for is that my long involvement in the women's movement in this country has taught me the importance of listening and being empathetic and trying to actually not push your agenda. You know, you might think that feminists go with this ready, prepared agenda कि हम दुनिया को बदलेंगे, और लेकिन ये नहीं है. I mean, there is a sense of injustice, a sense of discrimination, a sense of anger, but there is also a sense of wanting to understand why people behave the way they do, and to see if one can engage in conversations and dialogue to try to transform that. I mean, it's not a cliche, if you look at the histories of feminism around the world, they haven't been violent histories. Not to say women are not violent, but the ways in which feminists have worked has been very different. Of course, the belief, which is always, you know, the thin edge of the wedge, सब कहते हैं ये तो होम ब्रेकर्स हैं, ये हैं, वो हैं, इन्होंने सींग पहने हुए हैं, ये सब कुछ करते हैं, वो सब तो है नहीं. We are just ordinary people. But I have to say that I have learned a lot from the feminist movement.
I mean, वो भूल गया मैं exact quote क्या था, but people that they claimed were witches were only women who wanted to live their lives. ये जो witchcraft के चक्कर में आपने इतने मारे, वो क्या औरतें होंगी कि पागल हो गई है, ये खाना नहीं बना रही. प्रॉब्ली इस तरह की बिल्कुल ही सिंपलिस्टिक डम चीजें होंगी जिसमें आपने उनको मार दिया होगा. या यहाँ पर भी ऑनर और इज्जत पे जो करते हैं कि वो रात को वेल चली गई थी पानी पीने, तो प्यासी मर जाती तो वो आप उसकी इज्जत करते. वो रात को वेल चली गई तो अब आपकी कारोकारी करनी पड़ी आपको. In terms of memory and reliability, people's history पे कुछ historians ये भी सवाल पूछते हैं कि it's not really history, but अगर हम सिर्फ अपनी बात करें, जो ऑथेंटिक हिस्ट्री भी हम इसको कहते हैं, वो कितनी ही ऑथेंटिक है, वो किसने लिखी है. अगर ब्रिटिश रिकॉर्ड्स आप देख रहे हैं, सो वो एक कॉलोनियल लेंस से आपको एक चीज बता रहे हैं. हाउ इज दैट मोर ऑथेंटिक देन somebody who lived through that?
Yeah, I think the mistake that we make is to try and set up a competition between two things which actually are very different things. So you can't really compare them and say कि ये उससे बेहतर है या ये उससे बेहतर है. I don't think that's easy to do. I think that within, for want of a better word, within quotes, traditional historical exploration, which is constructed in a frame that is colonial and which we have taken from the West, really, where temporality is seen in a particular way, historical sources and factuality, these are all seen in particular ways. The need for objectivity is seen as a really important need, all of these. While one may disagree with some of those things, I think it's important to realize that they do present to you certain dimensions of society and that you can't dismiss them. And you can't say, okay, ye to bilkul hi useless hai, and I'm going to go for oral history, the histories of people, people's stories, and try to replace that with this. I don't think that that's going to work. I think the important thing is to say that both have a place and both are necessary to our understanding of society. You know, the writer Eduardo Galeano, he talks about how when you're looking at Latin American history, it is always shot through with myth, with legend, with stories, with all of those things. And that's what it is like in our countries. वो सारा जो collective wisdom of society है जो कि हमारी कहानियों में, हमारे rituals में, हमारे customs में, इन सब चीज़ों में आता है, ये भी हमारी society का हिस्सा है. और अगर हम इनको समझ सकते हैं या इनको कुछ respect दे सकते हैं, in their own terms, you know, so not to judge them by the terms of, let's say, reliability, factuality, जो history करती है, but in their own terms, then we have a much richer understanding of our society. There are two things that that I'm thinking of here. One is, जैसे आप हिंदुस्तान की हिस्ट्री ले लें in the medieval period or something, उसमें ज़्यादातर जो हिस्ट्री है सिर्फ मुगलों के बारे में आपको बताया जाता है. लेकिन ये इतना बड़ा मुल्क है, इसमें उसी टाइम पीरियड में हर जगह पे कुछ ना कुछ हो रहा है. So is there a way that we can capture that spatial experience without looking at one line of kings? Because that's not the only picture. That may be the dominant picture, but इधर भी कुछ हो रहा था, उधर भी कुछ हो रहा था. वो सब चीजें हैं जो आपको लेनी चाहिए. So that's one thing that throws up the ways in which history is understood chronologically and in linear questions that. And I think it's important to look at that. And the second thing is कि उस वक्त ओके राजे महाराजे जो कुछ भी कर रहे थे, लेकिन आम जनता जो है उनके बीच में क्या हो रहा है. सो ताजमहल को बनाया किसने? लोगों ने बनाया ना. तो वो जो कारीगर थे उनकी कहानियां क्या हैं, कहाँ से आए, उन्होंने अपनी क्राफ्ट कहाँ से सीखी, उनकी फैमिलीज में खाने पीने का क्या इंतजाम था. Why should these things not be part of our history? So if we can get them to be part of our history, I think that's really important. And those two, keeping those perspectives without saying this is more valuable, that's more valuable, without bringing the questions of one onto the other. कि अच्छा ये history fact पे based है तो यहाँ पे factuality कैसे हो सकती है? And I always give this example कि मेरी partition की research में there was a woman I talked to, दमयंती सहगल उनका नाम था, और उन्होंने मुझे एक कहानी बताई about a abducted woman that she forcibly rescued. And she said कि वो औरत जाना नहीं चाह रही थी क्योंकि उसका किसी मुसलमान जो लड़का उसको ले गया था उसके साथ इश्क हो गया था. And so Damayanti and her team of police officers heard that the Pakistani Prime Minister was coming by a train, special train, in the place where they were, मुझे उसका नाम भूल गया है, and that he would stop at the station to meet some people. So they went there to try and talk to him, to seek his support, to get this woman out of the clutches of this man. She described the trains and everything in great detail. And I took it down, और सालों के बाद मुझे एक किताब में कॉल्ड डॉक्यूमेंट्स ऑफ पार्टीशन वो उस इंसिडेंट का पूरा अकाउंट मिला. इट वाज मैचिंग इन एवरी डिटेल except one. The person was not the Prime Minister of Pakistan, but the Foreign Minister. Now you tell me, if you try to ask this question factually, दमयंती का फैक्ट एक क्रूशल फैक्ट इनकरेक्ट था, लेकिन उस कहानी की वैल्यू उस फैक्ट में है या कि इसमें कि एक सरकारी अफसर दूसरे मुल्क की सरकार के साथ बात कर सकती है अबाउट abducted woman and she knows that she will get help from there and she does get help from there, and that woman who is the subject of this thing, her autonomy is violated and she's forcibly brought back. That's the real story, no? Not whether the fact of whether it was Liaquat Ali Khan or somebody else is correct or not. So
फॉरेन चौधरी जफरुल्लाह होंगे probably अगर फॉरेन मिनिस्टर थे.
हाँ, हो सकता है, अब मुझे वो याद नहीं है. तो ये चीज है that you know this business of fact also is a very
it's political and it's decision making. आयशा जलाल का बहुत अच्छा कोट है कि हमने हिस्ट्री को आइडियोलॉजी से रिप्लेस कर दिया है. हम पाकिस्तान में एटलीस्ट आइडियोलॉजी पढ़ाते हैं एंड हम तो अभी पीपल्स हिस्ट्री की बात कर रहे हैं, बट फिक्शन की भी अगर बात कर लें, आपने खोलदो का जिक्र किया, मंटो को पढ़ के आपको उतना ही पार्टीशन समझ में आता है, बल्कि ज्यादा समझ में आता है पाक स्टडीज पढ़ने के बनिस्बत. बट द आइडिया इज के we're not pitting them against each other, but एडी इजार्ड का एक बहुत अच्छा जोक है कि ब्रिटिश की सबसे अच्छी इन्वेंशन वाज फ्लैग्स. They'd go to countries and be like, are you a nation? They're like, no, we've lived here for centuries. And they'd be like, do you have a flag? No, we don't have a flag. So they're like, now we claim this in the name of Her Majesty. तो वो जो एकेडमिक गेट कीपिंग है, वो जो इन्होंने अपने इंस्टीट्यूशंस बनाए हुए हैं, अगर हम अमेरिका की भी बात करें तो वो क्या पढ़ाते हैं कि नेटिव अमेरिकन तो पागल फिर रहे थे यहाँ पर. क्यों? क्योंकि उनकी ओरल हिस्ट्रीज आर डीवैल्यूड. हमारे ट्रेडिशन में सिमिलरली ओरल हिस्ट्रीज की बहुत ज्यादा वैल्यू है, लेकिन जब एक कॉलोनियल सिस्टम आता है और वो कहते हैं तो फैक्चुअली नहीं है. So just the act of writing a people's history or elevating or saying this is also part of the conversation, it's not a competition, but it is still resistance telling those stories.
Yeah, that is, yeah, I suppose that is, but you know, it depends what you're trying to do. So I always say, जब मैंने ये काम शुरू किया था, तो ये नहीं है कि मुझे जो एकेडमिक क्रेडिबिलिटी होती है उसकी तरफ लगाव नहीं था. In fact, when I started writing in the academic mold, you know, and I kept getting very fed up because it was like, I felt ही क्या है कबाड़, मैंने नहीं लिखना ये सब कुछ, you know. So then at some point I asked myself this question that, you know, you're not a historian, you're not an academic, तुमने कहीं academics में career नहीं बनाना है, तो क्यों ये कर रही हो? You know, why are you trying to fit into the mold that you don't want to fit into? And I cannot tell you how liberating it was. And I decided, okay, and I remembered that when I was in college, मैं जब अपनी MA कर रही थी यहाँ पे, तो मेरी एक tutor थी, एक बहुत ही बढ़िया औरत थी. She made me, I wrote a term paper for her on Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. उन्होंने वो पढ़ के मेरी तरफ फेंक दिया और बोले ये गंद है, दोबारा से लिख के लाओ. And I was very upset. मैं 21 साल की थी और you know, दिल टूट जाता है, आपकी हीरो वर्शिप करते हो आप टीचर को, वो आपको ये बोल दे. पर मैंने लिखा दोबारा से, एंड शहजाद यू विल नॉट बिलीव इट, उन्होंने मुझसे 9 या 10 बार वो पेपर दोबारा से लिखवाया. 10वीं बार मैंने जब उनको दिया तो मैंने रोते रोते लिखा और उनको दिया. एंड देन शी रेड इट एंड शी सेड टू मी that this is a gem, don't ever forget that you must write from the heart, don't try to write in an academic fashion. I've never forgotten that lesson. So ये किताब लिखने में मैं शुरू तो किया था academically. Then I thought, Mrs. Krishna ने मुझे ये बताया था, ये मुझे सोचना चाहिए. और उस वक्त मैं एक नॉवल पढ़ रही थी कॉल्ड कैप्टन कोरेलीज मैंडोलिन, और उसमें एक इंसान है जो यही चीज कर रहा है, वो उस आइलैंड की हिस्ट्री लिखने की कोशिश कर रहा है, तंग आ जाता है, फाड़ फूट के फेंक देता है, और फिर वो लिखता है अ पर्सनल हिस्ट्री एंड देन इज हैप्पी. So that's eventually what I did. That I thought, ठीक है, I'll do it this way. And I didn't have to make a career in academics, so it didn't matter. But if you are in that mold and you're a young academic and you have to make a career, फिर आपके पास ये choice इतनी आसानी से नहीं आती है. And your act of resistance is against very entrenched power structures. You know, so that is it's very difficult to make. It requires a lot of courage. For me, it didn't matter. ना मुझे नौकरी लगनी थी, ना कुछ. मैं अपना पब्लिशिंग कर रही हूँ, मैंने अपने मन की बात कर दी, किसी ने एक्सेप्ट किया नहीं किया, ठीक है. So in fact, I was surprised by the way my book was accepted when it was written. Pleasantly surprised, because I'm also a publisher, so I'm quite realistic कि किताबें कहाँ तक जा सकती हैं, कहाँ तक नहीं जा सकती. But ये था कि कुछ freedom था in wanting, in writing it the way I wanted to. So that's not a privilege that's available to many people.
It's also great advice as a publisher. अगर कोई जुबान बुक सबमिट कर रहा है, दिल से लिखो. आप भी अब मिस कृष्णा की तरह उनको 9 दफा रिवाइज करें कि यार ये क्या भेज रहे हो मुझे, जरा दिल से लिखो. इसका मुझे आपसे ये पूछना था कि अब जो डिस्कशन हो रहा है इन टर्म्स ऑफ राइटिंग, डिमिनिश बिल्कुल नहीं करने चाहिए लिव्ड एक्सपीरियंस, बट शायद थोड़ी ओवर करेक्शन भी हो रही है, where they've come to the point where you're like you can't write about it. So I mean the idea that agar koi cis woman is researching on trans, there is resistance to that idea कि ये आपकी identity है नहीं, आप इसके बारे में लिख ही नहीं सकते. So as a publisher, are you grappling with those ideas, and what's your take on these notions?
Yeah, it's a very real question. I'm grappling with it both as a publisher and as a writer. So, I think the bigger question of can only like write about like is a question to which we don't as yet have a clear answer, and is a question to which I don't think we can say an unqualified yes or no. But I think that in the political context in which, let's say, people's communities who have been traditionally silenced and are now amplifying their voices, I think when you're looking at literature about those communities, it's very important as a publisher, as a writer, also to say and to do that those voices must find articulation. And therefore, whatever you can do to create the enabling conditions, you have to do. And if that means that you don't enter that terrain as a writer, then that was also something that you have. I don't think you can lay any rules down, but I think to understand why it's happening, where it's happening is essential. So हम लोग जो किताबें छापते हैं उसमें हमारा हमेशा ये होता है, it's not a, we're not लकीर के फकीर के ये कोई नहीं करेगा, but we still try as much as possible to make sure that those voices come out from within the community. Now, having said that, let me tell you that I am currently grappling with this thing as personally as a writer, because my friend Mona, who died 4 years ago, Mona wanted me to write a book about her. And she made me promise that I would do it, and she wanted it in her lifetime. वो तो मैं नहीं कर पाई. But I've almost finished work on the book. I am writing it. And that question arises for me too. And, Mona was trans, I'm not trans. Should I be writing about her, etc., etc. But my question also is that the book is not about a trans person. The book is about a person who's a very complex human being and who occupies many identities. And of all her friends, of all the people who knew her, and she didn't know many, there are only two people who knew her intimately. One of them is a photographer called Dayanita Singh, and one of them is me. So for me, for 22 or 23 years that I knew Mona, I met her every Sunday. Every week we met, except when I wasn't in Delhi. None of her other friends has met her or known her in that. So now the other question that arises is that suppose somebody who's trans writes about her. Does the fact that they occupy that identity, should it hold more sway than 25 years of, or 22 or 20, whatever years of a close, intimate relationship where you shared a lot? And I don't have the answer to that. I really don't know. So I'm writing this book and मुझे मालूम नहीं है कि मेरा जिगरा होगा इसको छापने का या नहीं. अभी तो मैं लिख रही हूँ मोना के लिए to fulfill the responsibility to her, and I've shown it to 2 or 3 friends. लेकिन हेजिटेशन है, डर भी है, करना एंड एथिकल क्वेश्चन भी हैं, ये सब हैं. और एक बार आप किताब को लिख के उसको दुनिया में भेज दो तो आप उसको वापस नहीं ले सकते. So it's a, like all questions, there's no हाँ या ना आंसर टू इट.
एक अच्छा गाइडिंग प्रिंसिपल है. आई थिंक कैनेडियन एबोरिजिनी कम्युनिटी ने कहा था कि नथिंग अबाउट अस विदाउट अस, एंड हिस्टोरिकली इट्स बीन रिटन अबाउट पीपल विदाउट देम. बिल्कुल ये एक फॉरेन लेंस से दिखा जा रहा होता है. सो रेजिस्टेंस सारी उसकी है, बट वो ऑब्वियसली वो गेहूं के साथ घिस पिस जाते हैं. एवरीथिंग गेट्स क्लब्ड इन टुगेदर. इट इज कॉम्प्लिकेटेड बिकॉज सिंगुलर आइडेंटिटीज तो नहीं होती. सो लेट्स से इफ इट्स अ ट्रांस पर्सन, बट जो रिलीजियस आइडेंटिटी थी मोना की वो नहीं है, जो सोशल आइडेंटिटी थी वो नहीं है, जो क्लास आइडेंटिटी थी वो नहीं है. सो देन and then when it comes to fiction, it's even more complicated, right? If I am to write a fictional book, do I just write about my own identity? सब क्या उसी identity के होंगे उस fiction में?
The writer has to find all sorts of characters to build. Yeah.
I thought Manto wrote women really well. I think एक बहुत वेरिड पर्सपेक्टिव मिल रहा था जो शायद उस टाइम कुछ फीमेल राइटर से भी नहीं मिल रहा था. शायद इस पे भी मुझे क्रिटिसिज्म है, सॉरी मैंने बोल दिया ये, लेकिन आई रियली लाइक मंटो. सो आई नो कि ये ग्रैपल ही होते हैं आइडियाज और कॉम्प्लिकेटेड ही होते हैं, बट व्हेन यू से कि वी आर अ फेमिनिस्ट पब्लिशिंग हाउस एंड वी राइट वी encourage more feminist literature, I'm sure it goes beyond just the identity of the woman. Is there any ethos or guiding principles that you have when it comes to what the decisions as to what to publish and what to accept?
Yeah, many. Again, that changes over time. When we started, which is like about 37 years ago, 84 में हमने शुरू किया था, तो उस वक्त हमने ये शुरू किया था कि औरतों की आवाज़ें बिल्कुल हैं नहीं लिटरेचर में, राइटिंग में. So to bring those voices to public attention. And it was a question of also numbers, to try and bring in as many as possible. Then we started to unpack that category woman and say कि हिंदुस्तान में अगर हम, क्योंकि हम दिल्ली से publish कर रहे हैं, if we are publishing women who are writing in English, if they are urban, they are Western educated, तो इस मुल्क की reality को वो कैसे reflect करें. So we started to think of going beyond that and looking at languages. And over a period of time, we have just expanded that more and more and more. And now the focus is very much on people from the margins. So we publish a lot of queer work. We publish a lot of work by trans people. We publish a lot of work by Dalits. We will focus not only on marginalized identities in the form of identity, but also marginalized locations. So, for example, the northeastern states of India, which are generally seen as the periphery. So we have a really, we've been publishing on the northeast before it became sexy. Now it's very sexy, but सालों से हम किताबें छाप रहे हैं वहाँ पे. On Kashmir, we do quite a lot on Kashmir, and similarly other areas we consciously try to develop a list by Muslim women and so on. So the mainstream English urban writer now for us is comes lower down on the list, because ये नहीं है कि हम उनको छापना नहीं चाहते हैं, लेकिन उनके पास opportunities काफी हैं और बड़े-बड़े publisher उनको छाप रहे हैं. So we see our role more as experimenting and exploring new ground.
And I think it's all part of the evolution as well, right? जिस तरह आपने पहले भी जिक्र किया था कि आपने जब काली फॉर विमेन रखा उसका नाम, तो एक क्रिश्चियन जर्नलिस्ट थी जिन्होंने आपको क्वेश्चन किया कि you're still using Hindu symbolism. So we all evolve, we learn. और मुझे पता है ये भी आपकी एक जहाद है, लेकिन मैं सिर्फ इसलिए ये सवाल पूछ रहा हूँ कि जो लोग ये बात करते हैं उनको आप शट अप कॉल दे सकें. ये मेरा खुद का सवाल नहीं है. Can a feminist publishing house be commercially viable? ये मेरा सवाल नहीं है, ये मैं आपको अपॉर्चुनिटी दे रहा हूँ कि जो ये बातें करते हैं उनको आप एक शट अप कॉल दे सके.
See, why not? I mean, a feminist publishing house must be commercially viable, but commercial viability also has to do with many other things, which sadly feminist publishers don't have, and often they don't want to have. So over the years, I mean, we have, like all publishers, there are years when we have been commercially viable, we have broken even. There are years when we have made a small profit. The profit doesn't go into our pockets, it goes right back into the business. And there are years when we have made a loss. हर एक बिजनेस की ये ट्रैजेक्टरी होती है ऊपर नीचे की. वी आर नो डिफरेंट, हमारा स्केल थोड़ा छोटा है अदर पब्लिशिंग हाउसेस से. सो जैसे पिछला 1.5 साल है, इसमें किसी ने कोई पैसा नहीं बनाया, तो हमने भी कोई पैसा नहीं बनाया, लेकिन इसका असर हमारे ऊपर ज्यादा गहरा होगा इसलिए कि हमारी गहरी जेबें नहीं है.
डीप पॉकेट्स.
हाँ, डीप पॉकेट्स, जिसमें से आप पैसा निकालते जाओ. और हम जिन चीजों को प्रायोरिटाइज करते हैं वो हो सकता है कि कमर्शियल हाउसेस उनको ना करें, कि हमारे लिए सिर्फ प्रॉफिट ही नहीं है, और प्रॉफिट इज जस्ट अ वे ऑफ स्टेइंग अलाइव. It's not the motivation. The motivation is the politics. But it is also that we want to do right by the people we employ. We want to be feminist not only in what we publish, but in everything we do, in the way we work, in the way we run our organization, vagera, vagera. So commercial viability, I think, is not the only question. To me, okay, if we can make enough money to break even and pay the salaries, we are okay. I don't even want to be earning pots of money. What we don't want is that to keep commercial viability as a horizon and therefore let it compromise the quality of what we do and publish only those books that are commercially viable. So जो हमें ये सवाल पूछता है, मुझे लगता है कि उनकी दिमाग में ऑलरेडी ये प्रेजुडिस है कि commercial viability equals success. हमारे दिमाग में ये नहीं है. We see ourselves, we have created in the years that we have been around without any capital. There's been no, आजकल उनको शुगर डैडी नहीं कहते हैं, उनको ग्लूकोज कुछ कहते हैं, मुझे पता नहीं क्या वर्ड होता है, ग्लूकोज. हम
अब तक शुगर डैडीज पे ही चल रहे हैं, बिकॉज़ हमारे जो गवर्नमेंट है उनके भी एक शुगर डैडी है, वो शुगर इंडस्ट्री जो चलाते हैं, तो यहाँ बहुत पॉपुलर है शुगर डैडी.
वो जो भी ग्लूकोज देने वाले हैं, हमारी जिंदगी में कख नहीं है, एक भी नहीं आया, और हमने चाहा भी नहीं है कि वो आए. हम चाहते हैं कि हम अपने ही पैसों पे, जो भी हमारे थोड़े बहुत पैसे हैं, उस पे इसको चलाएं, और वो हमने किया है. 37 साल के लिए हम जिंदा रहे, और उस 37 सालों में जो किताबें हमने छापी हैं, those I think are path breaking books. I think और कोई बेशक ना कहे, लेकिन हम जानते हैं कि the shape of literature, the shape of books, that has been changed radically in the world by feminist publishers, and we have been part of that. That's enough of a success. ऐसा आता है, जाता है, छोड़ो, क्या करना है.
उनको आप गाना भेज दिया करें, अगर कोई पूछे क्यों पैसा करती है, क्यों पैसे पे तुम्हारी. उसको एंड इट्स आल्सो इंटरेस्टिंग कि आपको ये काफी दफा सवाल आता है, बट नॉर्मल पब्लिशिंग हाउस कौन प्रॉफिटेबल है आज के दिन में? नॉन फेमिनिस्ट पब्लिशिंग हाउस कौन पैसे कमा रहा है? कोई पब्लिशिंग हाउस आजकल पैसे कमा नहीं रहा।
बिल्कुल नहीं कमा रहे, क्योंकि इट्स नॉट अ प्रोफेशन, इट्स लाइक अ हेवी ड्यूटी, हेवी इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड नॉट इनफ रिटर्न। वो इकोनॉमी टेढ़ी है पब्लिशिंग की। और ये है कि हमारे जो बायर्स हैं, किताबें खरीदने वाले, आपके यहाँ भी ये होगा, मेरे ख्याल कनाडा में भी ये होगा, किताब की कीमत इतनी सी बढ़ाओ, लोग चिल्लाते हैं, अरे 400 रुपए की किताब। अरे आप 400 रुपए में एक हैमबर्गर खरीदते हो, अब दिन भर पूरे महीने में आप 30 हैमबर्गर खा लोगे, लेकिन एक किताब नहीं खरीदोगे 400। ये भी है। सो दिस इज ऑल्सो समथिंग यू हैव टू बैटल।
आई थिंक इट्स ऑल्सो कि जो लोग किताब पढ़ना चाहते हैं, मैं जनरलाइज कर रहा हूँ, मैं ज्यादातर एटलीस्ट आर ऑफ अ सर्टेन एज। सो फॉर इंस्टेंस इवन एज अ स्टूडेंट जब मैं यूनिवर्सिटी में था, आई फाउंड एकेडेमिया वेरी इनएक्सेसिबल। कि अगर वो किताब मेरी यूनिवर्सिटी की लाइब्रेरी में नहीं है तो वो अनलेस कोई ऑनलाइन, एंड मैं माफी चाहता हूँ मैंने जो जो इलीगल डाउनलोड करके पढ़ी है, अनलेस वो इलीगली मुझे कहीं से पीडीएफ मिल जाए, they weren't very accessible, right? If I'm going to go to Amazon book, and yes, maybe some of my meals would cost more than that book, but it's not exactly accessible to students.
See, that is not to do with publishers. I mean, it is to do with publishers, but it's not a much bigger problem. And I think it's a problem of academia where the need for academics to publish is linked with progress in jobs. So you have to publish in order to get tenure, you have to publish in order to do this, and you have to publish with academic presses. और वो जो एकेडमिक प्रेसेस होती हैं वो सब चोर होते हैं, उनको पता है, और वो किताब को की कीमत हजारों रुपए रखती हैं, क्योंकि उनको कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता है कि आप लोग स्टूडेंट्स जो हो उनको इस किताब की जरूरत है। उनको क्या चाहिए कि उस किताब की 200 कॉपी छाप दी उन्होंने, अपना पैसा रिकवर कर लिया, बाकी लोग भाड़ में जाएं। हमारे जैसे पब्लिशर जो हैं, हमारी फिलॉसफी अलग है। हम चाहते हैं कि वो किताब दूर दूर तक पहुंचे, हम चाहते हैं that students are able to read and afford those books, but we don't have the kind of backup and capital and so on to be able to do that. So the opposition to the expensiveness of books is perfectly justified, and the fact that students cannot buy those books at huge prices, I agree, and therefore they will get them in whatever way they can. That's fine. मैंने भी बचपन में ये किया, except that उस वक्त ये नहीं होता था।
फोटोकॉपी होते थे ना, मेरे स्कूल में हम लोग फोटोकॉपी करवाते थे।
हमारे टाइम पे तो फोटोकॉपी भी नहीं होता था, वो गेस्टेटनर से करते थे। But still, ये सब चीजें हैं, but one has to, I think, address that problem where it is. It's not only a publisher's problem. And like we try to do it, address it in whichever possible way. For example, हम अपनी e-books जब बनाते हैं and we put them on our website, we put them without DRM. We don't lock it, so anybody who buys an e-book can share it with 10 friends. It's not locked to your device, because we believe, one, that we must try to make things available to students. Two, that अगर आपने कोई फिजिकल कॉपी खरीदी हमसे, तो आप पढ़ के किसी को लेंड कर दोगे, वो आगे किसी को लेंड कर देगा, तो वही चीज डिजिटल में क्यों नहीं होनी चाहिए। बहुत से पब्लिशर होते हैं जो उसको लॉक कर देते हैं, और ऑफ कोर्स दे लॉक इट ऑन द assumption that students will not be able to open the locks, but सब खोल लेते हैं सब कुछ। So अगर खोल ही लेते हैं तो फिर क्यों ना हम खुला ही छोड़ दें। So जहाँ तक हो सकता है we will do whatever it is that we can to help that, but we can't do it all the time, because जीना तो हमको भी है।
नहीं, आई थिंक स्मॉल पब्लिशिंग हाउसेस को सबको सपोर्ट करना चाहिए। एकेडमिक जर्नल्स एक फ्रॉड है, क्योंकि जो एकेडमिक है वो भी उनको पैसे देता है, जो खरीदता है वो भी उनको पैसे देता है, वो बीच में कर क्या रहे हैं। आई नो हमने आपका बहुत ज्यादा टाइम ले लिया, आई कैन लिटरली सिट हियर एंड टॉक टू यू फॉर आवर्स। लोगों ने फेरिस्तें भेजी हुई हैं क्वेश्चंस की, आई जस्ट वांट टू गेट टू अ कपल ऑफ देम, ताकि ऑडियंस ये ना बोले कि तुम सारे अपनी बातें कर लेते हो, हमारे सवाल नहीं पूछते हैं। सो वी कैन ब्रीफली एड्रेस देम। Does she think that we will ever see the effects of colonialism unwind? My answer to that is no. But what's your take?
I don't know. I'm glad you're saying, well, itni definitely आप no कह रहे हो. I would like to be.
मेरा कुछ जाता नहीं है ना, मेरी थोड़ी कोई credibility है, मुझे थोड़ी कोई कुछ बोलेगा.
No, but truly I don't know. How can we say? Because it's not just a question of time. ना ये नहीं है कि समय निकल जाए तो वो unwind हो जाएगा. और बहुत सी और चीजें होती हैं. And it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't think I can.
मेरा कॉन्फिडेंस इसलिए भी था because I think colonialism has not unwinded. Effects तो दूर की बात, legacy तो दूर की बात, आप living colonialism देख रहे हैं कि वो जीता जागता भी इंसान है. वो खत्म तो करें पहले, फिर उसकी effects की बात है. अभी तो खत्म ही नहीं हुआ.
और वो इतनी सारी चीजों में है ना, ये मतलब वो राज करने वाले चले गए हैं, लेकिन उसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि दूर दूर से वो अपना पावर एक्सरसाइज नहीं कर रहे हैं इन डिफरेंट वेज. सो तरीके बदल गए हैं. And to get out of that is very difficult, because also the only route out of it, which is being sort of talked about, is the complete opposite, which is the essentialist fundamentalist route, and you don't want that either, no? So I can't answer that question.
किसी ने बोला lots of questions about Partition Museum, but lots of लिखे नहीं है. जो लिखा है वो ये है, what's stopping them from making one in Pakistan?
ये तो आप बता सकते हैं मुझे.
हमें कॉन्फ्रेंस नहीं करने देते. म्यूजियम कहाँ बनाएंगे वो? जो
ये लगता है, देखिए, अगर हमारी दोनों सरकारें थोड़ी सी बहादुरी करें, नहीं करेंगे, डरते हैं ना, लेकिन करें. The best place for the Partition Museum is at the Wagah border. It should be on both sides, and आते जाते लोग, there should be a video thing जो एक दूसरे से बात कर सकें. I think that would be so nice if we did it, but नहीं करेंगे. कौन करेगा?
Is militancy in Kashmir patriarchal? We seldom ever see women participation in military since its inception. Instead, women could be seen more invested in academics. What challenges do women face in day-to-day lives?
नहीं, ये actually सही नहीं है. I mean, I have not worked that much on Kashmir. मैंने बहुत देर पहले एक किताब की थी, लेकिन हमने recently एक किताब छापी है, which I would suggest, and I'm not doing this as a publicity for our books. Please believe that, because I don't like doing that. Lekin this book might help you to understand your question. It's a book called Love, Loss and Longing in Kashmir, and it's by a woman called Sehba Hussain. और सहबा ने, शी इज़ नॉट फ्रॉम कश्मीर, लेकिन उसने 10 साल कश्मीर में काम किया है. And one of the things that she has explored very deeply in this book is exactly the question that you asked. Is militancy patriarchal? And she has looked at what militancy has done to women, and she has also looked at women who have joined or become part of the overall discourse of militancy without becoming militants themselves, but women who have set up different organizations to work with women, to support different political organizations and so on, and also looked at women like Parveena Ahangar and others who have set up the Association of Parents of the Disappeared People. But and Sehba has interviews with some of these women. So it's a very, very interesting understanding of women in Kashmir and the many sort of, not only how they have become victims, but how they have also fought to change their realities. So rather than my giving you a summary of that book, if you wanted to, then I would suggest you read it, and you can pick up an ebook. It's quite reasonably priced. I think it will be 400-500. I'm not exactly.
अब मैं खरीद लेता हूँ. आपने समझा कि ये तो है ही ऐसा जो बुक e-books खरीदता. I've also recently really gotten into audiobooks. I think they're phenomenal.
Yeah, that's something we have to do. We haven't done that yet, but
Especially, I think during the pandemic, this podcast has also erupted that long form. I think लोगों की appetite बन गई है. अगर आप कहीं drive कर रहे हैं या आप gym कर रहे हैं, just have that and listen to an audio book. What is the biggest threat to India's secularism? अब ये भी बहुत ही broad मुश्किल सवाल है.
इसका तो मैं जवाब कतई नहीं दे सकती. मैं कैसे बता सकती हूँ? What is the biggest threat to India's secularism?
अच्छा हुआ उन्होंने ये नहीं पूछा who is the biggest threat. शायद उसका simpler जवाब हो सकता है.
I don't know. I think there are many threats. It's really difficult to say. But certainly, yes, the rise of majoritarian political religion is definitely one of them, but it's not the only one, because when that was not around, secularism was still under threat in one way or the other. So I think it's this, this impossible marriage, or not impossible marriage, but this, what's the word? Deeply entangled marriage of politics and religion, जो हमारे मुल्कों में अलग हो ही नहीं सका है आज तक.
ये भी मुश्किल ही सवाल है, but I do think it's an apt, perfect question to end this on. How do we deal with the intergenerational trauma of partition?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think, one of the things in our countries is that while we have dealt reasonably okay, and I say reasonably okay, not well or anything, but given the fact that both India and Pakistan were really speaking fledgling states at the time of in 1947, to deal with the consequences of partition at that time with an unpreparedness for massive rehabilitation, massive movement, massive paperwork, all of that. I think that there are ways in which we did manage to deal with those in some way. Not well, वो हो भी नहीं सकता था. लेकिन जिस प्रॉब्लम को हमने बिल्कुल ही एड्रेस नहीं किया, हम कर भी नहीं सके, और क्वेश्चन ये भी है कि is this something that states can do? And I think perhaps not. Is the psychological impact and the psychological rehabilitation of populations, people. And the deep legacies of those have become clear after so many years. And again, I'll direct you to the work of 2 or 3 people, and it's not a book we published, so I can be quite okay about saying it. On this side of the border, this is a psychiatrist called Alok Sareen and one called Sanjeev Jain. And they are practicing doctors who were very fascinated by the many patients who came to them who had lived through the trauma of partition, and they saw it in its many forms, and they started exploring that. And they've done some really, really interesting work on the psychological impact of partition. So how do we deal with intergenerational trauma? I don't know. I haven't answered your question. I've sort of given you oblique answers to it, which might lead you to looking at these people's work and thinking that there are some ways in there to address it. One of the things I continue to believe that is absolutely essential and will help us to address the wounds of partition, the histories of partition, the trauma of partition, is conversations across borders, is dialogues across borders, is honest conversations where we confront our past and say, yes, we did this, how do we get out of it? And is also something that is happening in different parts of the world. Sadly, it's not happening between our 2 countries, but if it was possible, it would be great, which is joint projects. जैसे जब हमारे मुल्कों में थोड़ा सा खुलासा हुआ था, तो कभी ये हो रहा था कि पाकिस्तान से स्टूडेंट्स इंडियन कॉलेज में आ जाते थे, इंडियन लॉयर्स उधर चले जाते थे. These things may seem like small things.
बनाल जी.
पर उनसे फर्क पड़ता है, बिकॉज वो जो एक हुआ बन जाता है ना, कि आपके लोग ऐसे हैं, हमारे लोग ऐसे हैं, etc. And in pre-internet days, that Hawa was very, very big. That goes when you meet people and see they're just ordinary people. They're just like you and me and everything. So that starts the process of change a little bit. And I think difficult conversations open up there. So I think we have to have those difficult conversations.
And just a very quick follow-up on this. I've been thinking about this a lot, and now I believe this. I want to know if you do also. In the physicality of intergenerational trauma, एक तो mental health होता है, but I think we live it in our bodies. Even if somebody was to wipe our memories, वो कहीं ना कहीं आपकी literal जिस्म में होता है वो, अगर intergenerational trauma हो.
नहीं, सही बात है, वो होता है, but how to deal with it, I wouldn't know, because it really needs somebody who is more, who is professional, who is more skilled, who has a deeper understanding of it, to say कि इसके ये जो अलग अलग तरह के इफेक्ट्स होते हैं, इनको आप किस तरह से सही कर सकते हैं.
I think पहला step जी जी
से कि जरूरी है कुछ करना, बट क्या करना ये मैं तो अनाड़ी समझती हूँ अपने आप को, इसमें क्या कर सकते.
आई थिंक जो भी ट्रॉमा हो, पहला स्टेप एक्नॉलेजमेंट होता है. माने तो फिर सिलसिला शुरू करते हैं कि डील कैसे करना है. एंड एज ऑलवेज कंक्लूजन सिमिलर ही होता है कि ह्यूमनाइज करें, एक दूसरे को इंसान समझें, पहले देखें उसकी इंसानियत, एंड देन प्यार और मोहब्बत और बातें और कई रास्ते खुल सकते हैं. बहुत ज्यादा मजा आया आपसे बात करके. थैंक यू सो मच फॉर गिविंग मी दिस टाइम. इट वाज एन ऑनर एंड अ प्रिविलेज. थैंक यू सो मच.
2 घंटे ऐसे ही निकल गए, पता भी नहीं चला.
मैंने वही टाइम देखा है ना, वाज लाइक मैं कसम से 2 और घंटे ये कर सकता हूँ. वी वुड लव टू हैव यू बैक अगेन सम टाइम इन द फ्यूचर एज वेल. थैंक यू सो मच.
You come back, you take care. Thank you so much.
Take care and thank you everybody for listening. Bye bye.